Chapter 757. Time was ticking away, second by second. With the ticking of the clock in the corner, the rhythmic ticking of the second hand repeatedly spread in the lounge. Every tick was like a strand of spider silk. Those invisible spider webs floated in the air and landed on the two of them. They coiled around each other, layer upon layer, until finally they became an airtight cocoon. In the silence, he felt an indescribable suffocation. 6 hours later, another 6 hours passed. The soft and comfortable sofa seemed to have become an iron felt, and the ticking sound of every second was like a ruthless axe and hammer. He could feel his hope gradually withered and wilted after each collision. Several times, Shang Tianmu clenched his hand in anger and wanted to get up, but he seemed to have no strength to support himself and let go of his hand in vain. Patiently waiting, patiently waiting, patiently waiting, patiently waiting. The sound outside the door still sounded from time to time, but this time it didn't make him look forward to it. From the servants' hurried running to the ladies' delicate laughter, and finally there was no more sound. When the night gradually appeared, a lone lamp in the room illuminated the faces of the two. Like two inconspicuous specks of dust, so small that no one could remember them. Do we still have to wait? Huaishir asked for the 5th time, turning the phone in his hand that was close to a dangerous battery. Wait, Shang Tianmu said numbly. Wait. How long do we have to wait? Since we're already here, we have to meet. Before that, we have to wait. Shang Tianmu's lips opened and closed, swallowing the second half of the sentence. His eyes were numb and calm. Wait. Wait until death. Until the minute hand turned again. When Huaishir was ready to use the toilet to get some fresh air, he heard low footsteps behind the door, gradually approaching. As if sensing Huaishir behind the door, the person raised his hand and knocked on the door unhurriedly. Huaishir's movements paused for a moment as she felt an oppressive chill. Through the thick wooden door, he could hear the faint sound of the sharp blade in the scabbard. The chill fell on his neck and quickly dissipated. It was just the other party's subconscious vigilance. He took a step back. The door opened from the outside. It revealed the appearance of a middle-aged warrior who did not care about his appearance. She was wearing loose sportswear, with a hairpin on her head and a headband on her forehead. She looked like she had just come back from a long run, but there was an old long knife hanging from her waist. His face was unshaven. Only his eyes were as big as the eyes of an old monkey in the mountains, shining with a faint clear light. After entering the room, he stared at Huaishir in front of him and raised his eyebrows as if he was surprised. Are you Huaiji? Huaishir nodded. Yes, I am a warrior under the general. You can call me Zhu Chuan. I heard that you defeated Xiang Chuan. Oh, that little guy Xiang Chu. You're not bad. He raised his hand and patted Huaishir on the shoulder. After a few words of praise, he looked at Shang Tianmu solemnly and bowed slightly. Recently, I have been busy with official business. It is really difficult for the general to leave. There are many people under me who have neglected you. Please forgive me, Mr. Shang Tianmu. In the face of a general's most capable subordinate, Shang Tianmu did not dare to be arrogant. He propped up his body and bowed as well. It's nothing. I just waited a little longer. Even though he said that, the old man stared straight into his eyes, waiting for him to continue, until Zhu Chuan nodded and stepped aside. Please come with me. After the general finishes his business, you have 15 minutes to meet. Shang Tianmu nodded. He was not surprised or excited. Instead, he smiled calmly. Okay, but the hands behind his back were clenched with excitement. It was difficult to restrain the crazy heartbeat at this moment. After a long period of sitting, he finally got the result. Let go, Huaiji. He smiled at Huaishir and walked out of the door. Huaishir could feel that Shang Tianmu's footsteps, which were slightly unstable and hurried, seemed to be gradually relaxing. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Shang Tianmu was not afraid of this long period of sitting and being neglected. He was only afraid that he would return empty-handed today. But before Zhu Chuan arrived, no one knew what the result would be. If he just waited, that would be too good. Even if he was neglected or forgotten, it did not matter. It was not that there was no room for discussion. On the contrary, this was just a show of strength. The general wanted more than he could give. But it did not matter. He could give even more, as long as there was room for discussion. Huaishir stood behind him, watching as Shang Tianmu's back was gradually bent by a formless force, and he humbly moved forward. Even from a great distance away, it was possible to sense the origin-substance fluctuations that weren't concealed at all. It was like a mighty flood, enveloping the entire manor, wild and savage. They followed the corridor forward, passing through the silent courtyard and arriving at the beach. A bonfire was lit in the distance, brightly lit. Girls in bikinis were running and playing on the beach with water guns, showing off their impressive figures and beautiful faces. The waiters on both sides of the beach were respectfully interacting with them, and no one dared to raise their heads to take a look. Even from far away, they could hear the sound of laughter coming from under the umbrella. The golden-haired, middle-aged man sat on a chair with his back to them. He tossed the cards in his hand onto the table and cursed unhappily. "What kind of luck is this? You want my money again. Sooner or later, I'll hang you bastards." The subordinates who were playing cards with him were already used to this. They put away the chips on the table and thanked the general for his reward. When they sensed that Zhu Chuan had returned, they politely stood up and said their goodbyes. The game was temporarily over. The general stood up and scratched his buttocks through his pants. Finally, he turned around and looked at Shang Tianmu, who was walking in. He thought for a moment and suddenly realized, "I remember you. You're old man Shang Tianmu, right? We've played cards a few times before. When did you come? I almost forgot. Why didn't you rush me? I just waited a little longer. I wouldn't dare to disturb your mood." Shang Tianmu respectfully responded and bowed. Take a seat. Take a seat. There's no need to be so polite. I heard that you've been in a lot of trouble recently." The general looked at him and shook his head. He looked at Huaishir and asked curiously, "Who is this?" Being stared at by the pair of golden eyes from far away, Huaishir felt that his disguise had been exposed and he couldn't breathe. In the face of this powerful man, the number one person in the fifth stage, he respectfully took a step back and bowed with the etiquette of Yingzhou. "I'm from the Alliance, Huai Bai. Young man, you're quite polite." The general held a beer cup and laughed. He pointed at him and ordered Zhu Chuan beside him. "I'll talk to his parents. Get someone to take the children to find something to eat. Don't be shy. It's rare for you to come here. At least there's enough beer and barbecue." "Yes." Zhu Chuan nodded. A servant took Huaishir to the table on the beach and sat down. Soon, wine and barbecue were served. It was very sumptuous. Huaishir, on the other hand, wasn't embarrassed at all. She enjoyed the performance of those beautiful big sisters and started to eat without any scruples. But the glimmer of hope in his heart gradually sank. From far away, he could see the two people talking at the card table. "Tell me about it, Shang Tianmu." The general raised his cup and took a big gulp. He said calmly, "You spent so much energy and time to meet me. You can't just want to attend tonight's banquet, right?" Shang Tianmu bowed his head and asked sincerely, "I'm here on behalf of the Donbua Inner Circle to ask for your protection." He didn't waste any time in this meeting. He didn't show any suspense and didn't hold anything back. Shang Tianmu bowed his head and told the general about the current predicament of the alliance, all the offerings that the Donbua Inner Circle could offer to the general, the next plan, and the contributions that they could make to the general in the future. And the general listened to him politely. From time to time, he nodded in agreement with the bright future proposed by Shang Tianmu and felt indignant about the discrimination and oppression that the mixed race encountered. But his eyes were fixed on the girls playing on the beach in the distance. He appreciated the exquisite and beautiful scenery in front of him. He drank, ate, and smoked cigars. From beginning to end, he didn't look at Shang Tianmu. He just seemed to be listening. In fact, he didn't recognize any of the words. He didn't think about any of the offerings and requests that Shang Tianmu brought. But Shang Tianmu didn't dare to stop. Seizing this short period of time, he did everything he could to attract the general's attention, to make him change his mind, to make him reconsider everything that he had brought upon himself, even if it was only for a moment. But Huaishir felt that his efforts would not be of any use. Perhaps Sheng Tianmu's hope should have been disappointed long ago. Such a long wait. Perhaps it wasn't the general's show of strength. Perhaps he simply forgot about this matter. He was simply busy with other things. Busy drinking, busy having fun, busy playing cards with his subordinates, busy visiting prostitutes, busy doing other happy things. He wasn't interested in your price. Your suffering had nothing to do with him. Today, you worked hard to come here and meet him. Then he would meet you and treat you like any other guest. He would listen to your troubles and please, and then comfort and encourage you. But please don't misunderstand. This is just polite. The eagle god soared in the sky and lived in the temple in the clouds. Even if he was banished, he could only live in this remote island country and was exiled to the narrow territory of Yingzhou. The suffering on the ground was too insignificant. He wasn't interested in it. How do you feel, my guest? A strange and tender voice came from beside him. It was a child who sat down with a plate. Black hair, black eyes, and a fair complexion. He seemed to be from Rome, but he seemed to have the characteristics of other races. It was difficult to distinguish. The child, who was about 10 years old, carried a large plate of barbecued meat and beer as he sat beside Huai Shi. As if he was very familiar with her, he asked in a friendly manner, "How is the general's hospitality?" "Of course. I'm overwhelmed by your favor and can't thank you enough." Huai Shi didn't have time to think about the identity of the visitor. Since he came here with Sheng Tianmu, he was part of the alliance. Naturally, he couldn't be arrogant and make enemies for the alliance. Even if they couldn't reach anything in the end, he shouldn't be hated. The mischievous, black-haired child laughed. He opened his mouth and ate the barbecued meat in front of him. His mouth was full of sauce. He looked cute and tender. Who knew whose child he was? "It sounds very polite," he suddenly asked. "What do you think of this place? It's magnificent and beautiful. It's like a fairyland on earth." Huai Shi praised sincerely. "Well, that's true. Whether it's food or clothing, it's the best in the world. The best snow beef, the best beer, the best sauce, and the best oil. The best chef in the world, the best models and stars, the most loyal subordinates. There's endless money to lose and endless luxury and beauty to enjoy." The little boy nodded in agreement. Even the height of a children's dining chair is just right. It's easy to sit up. It's really enviable. You should hurry up and eat more. It wasn't just what the child said. As far as Huai Shi knew, the general had 6 more luxurious mansions like this in the whole Yingzhou. Kyoto, Edo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the most beautiful places in the country, the most dangerous and amazing scenery, were all the private property of the general. The strongest warriors, the best beauties, and the most beautiful scenery. All the glory and splendor in the world were rightfully his. Even just thinking about it, one could know how arrogant and indulgent his daily life was. It was unimaginable how happy he was. If it was in the past, Huai Shi would be so envious that he would drool all over the floor. But now, he couldn't be envious at all, because that person who had everything didn't look happy at all. The tyrant, who was once the strongest fifth-order warrior in the world, who was only one step away from being the master of the lineage, lost everything in a gamble. Not only was he expelled from America, but he was also exiled to this remote island country. He was also forcibly tied to the position of general by the former king of the White House. From then on, the fate of the country was linked. He could only associate with these yellow-skinned monkeys that he didn't care about at all. He should have been the most free person in the world, but he wasn't free at all. Who would be able to understand this anger? No matter how beautiful the scenery and luxurious the enjoyment was, to him, it was just a song and dance in a cage. It was a program to relieve his boredom in his long retirement life. Now, a group of insects came to him and told him that another group of insects oppressed him. Why would he care? During the conversation, Huai Shi sighed silently and finished the last barbecue on the plate. After stopping the waiter from serving him, he wiped his mouth and got up to say goodbye to the child beside him. The meeting was over. It was time for him to go. Come often in the future. The child said goodbye without raising his head. I like you very much. Let's play together next time. If there's a chance, Huai Shi smiled politely and greeted Sheng Tianmu, who was walking over. Sheng Tianmu still had a smile on his face. He didn't look angry or disappointed. He just declined other hospitality and turned to leave with Huai Shi. Behind them, excited shouts came from the beach. Okay, the game has started. The blindfolded blonde man raised 2 water guns and rushed to the beach excitedly. The eagle is coming. Where are my little babies? The girls dodged the water guns in a panic and covered their sensitive parts that were hit. They exclaimed in a sweet and sexy way. They looked so happy. Outside this beautiful paradise, dark clouds gradually gathered in the clear night sky in the distance, covering the lights of the city. It was going to rain. Chapter 758. What was the result of the meeting? When they left the city, Huai Shi couldn't help but ask in the driver's seat. There was no result. After a long time, Sheng Tianmu, who was resting with his eyes closed in the back seat, looked up and said slowly, "The general doesn't intend to protect Donbua Inner Circle, but he didn't completely reject it. He only said that measures will be taken when necessary." "Then do we continue the discussion?" Huai Shi asked. "It's just a politician's tone. There's no need to continue the discussion," Sheng Tianmu murmured. "It was originally just a glimmer of hope. Now that things have come to this, I'm too naive to expect to rely on others. Since I was born as a bastard, I can no longer dream of redemption." He said, "Let's prepare for war with all our might." In the long silence, Huai Shi's phone suddenly vibrated. A new email popped up on the navigation page. It was from an unknown address, but at a glance, it was a message from Hu Po's stinky sister. "The tax reform bill is pending. The outcome of the tug-of-war between the two parties is hard to determine. The emperor has lost his patience. Be prepared. There will be nothing in 5 days." When it rains, it pours. Huai Shi couldn't help but want to sigh. Couldn't the heavens give him good news? As if hearing his prayers, there was a sudden burst of fire in the woods in the distance. Steel rose into the sky with a spurting flame, aimed at their location, and then fell from the sky. A 60mm caliber Great News hit them in the face. RPG. Huai Shi only had time to curse before he stepped on the accelerator and turned the steering wheel. The car suddenly changed direction in the midst of speeding, swinging its butt and brushing past the weapon that should never have appeared in Yingzhou. Then, the explosion burst out from behind them. The blast swept over, causing the car to tremble like a fallen leaf, and almost overturned. When Huai Shi finally stabilized himself, he saw the lights of a motorcycle speeding in the night ahead. The engine roared and the lights quickly magnified. In the midst of ear-piercing screams and excited shouts, the rider suddenly jumped off the car. The next moment, the motorcycle and the car collided. The violent tumbling caused the sky and earth to spin. Huai Shi was thrown out of the car window and landed on the ground. He heard the roar of a motorcycle in the distance again. Several people on motorcycles excitedly turned the corner and chased after him. Someone jumped out of the vehicle and rushed straight to the smoke-shrouded vehicle, pulling Sheng Tianmu out of it. There was a cut on Heaven Eye's bald head, blood flowing out. When he was pulled out, he was gasping for breath with great difficulty, coughing violently. Then that person raised his hand, pulled out the shiny blade, and raised it. Bang! After a soft sound, the person who rushed forward stopped moving. He stiffened on the spot and slowly knelt on the ground, revealing the muzzle of the gun in his hand that was still emitting faint smoke. That old man stretched out his hand, pulled out the blade from his opponent's hand, raised it, and hacked down on his opponent's head. Blood splattered everywhere. He raised his face and roared, "You bastards, don't you know that I was born with the name Heavenly Eye?" He roared hoarsely, "You a bunch of useless bikers want to take my head?" His blood-stained old face was full of ferocity. When he took off the crooked and humble smile, he became as violent as a beast. The veins of blood in his eyes burned like a raging fire. "Come on," he challenged the attackers on the motorcycle. "Fight with me." Not only the opponents, but even Huai Shi, who wanted to rescue him, was shocked by his brave attitude. But no matter how shocked he was, now was not the time to be in a daze. Huai Shi, who had climbed up from the roadside, reached out and tore the car door from the broken basket. She aimed the car door at the person in front of her and slammed it down on his head. The loud sound of something breaking rang out, making one's scalp tingle. Without giving these guys a chance to start the engine, Huaishir had already rushed into the darkness behind the lights and smashed both the person and the car. In the dark forest in the distance, the person holding the launcher was stunned for a moment. Then he threw away the cumbersome rocket launcher in his hand, took out a large-caliber sniper rifle from the box beside him, and aimed at the fierce battle in the distance. In a flurry, he wanted to aim at Shang Tianmu's head. But before he could do anything, a mournful cry came from the sky. In the deep night, countless steel birds whistled, their sharp wings covering the last of the starlight, and the pure darkness swallowed everything. Only the high-pitched screams rang out, and then quickly extinguished, disappeared without a trace. Huaishir never dreamed that he would be attacked with an RPG on the edge of a metropolis like the capital. He almost capsized, and Shang Tianmu died in the hands of this group of bastards. This group of gangsters had changed their guns and entered a new era. He hated that he was an undercover agent of the Astronomy Society, and he couldn't even get a missile. How deep was this world's malice toward a tool like him? He had already prepared for a big battle, but unexpectedly, there were no sublimators among them. It was simply a group of racers who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Looking at their age, the oldest was only in his 20s, but they didn't hesitate at all. Each of them seemed to be used to this kind of thing, and each one was more ruthless than the other. Unfortunately, it was of no use at all. If ruthlessness was useful, what was the use of sublimators? The almost trampling battle quickly destroyed the morale of those people. At the very back, the commander supervising the battle didn't have time to be excited, and the smile on his face collapsed. He quickly turned the car around, pressed the accelerator to the max, and ignored his subordinates, preparing to escape. And in the same place, Huaishir bent down, picked up an iron bar from the motorcycle on the ground, took a deep breath, and aimed at his back. The iron bar flew out with a loud explosion. A straight afterimage streaked across the air. Immediately after, the roar of an explosion burst forth, and the motorcycle in the distance fell to the ground. Huaishir walked forward step by step, looking down at the half-dead commander on the ground. He casually grabbed his collar, turned around, and walked towards Shang Tianmu. It's the little bastards of the foolish company. As long as they can take drugs, they will do anything. Shang Tianmu didn't even bother to look at them. They're just cannon fodder. There's no need to interrogate them. The commander, whose hair was dyed in all sorts of colors, instantly turned pale. He opened his mouth and screamed, "It's the K-Gang. The K-Gang gave us money to bang." Shang Tianmu raised his hand and exploded his head, not wanting to hear the rest. Huaishir was stunned. Huh? Don't you plan to investigate who's behind this? Is there a need? Iron King Society, K Society, Heaven Fool Company, Illumination Cult, New G Group, Chivalry. He indifferently retracted his gaze. From a moment the general refused to protect us, all the illegal societies in the capital have become our enemies. This was just the beginning. Behind him, the wreckage of the car exploded, and flames rose in the night. Thick smoke billowed, covering the starlight. As the fine sound spread, a light drizzle fell from the sky. This was the precursor to the arrival of a storm. An hour later, in the headquarters of the Alliance, smoke lingered in the silent conference room. 2 hours ago, remember you jumped off a building, and a suicide note was left at the scene. Lawrence said faintly, "No matter what, it means that our 40 million was wasted, and the Ingzhou government refused to further communicate with Green Sunday." Huang Chuan raised his eyes and asked, "Does the commander have no plans to go further?" Lawrence was silent for a long time, then shrugged. This is the realm. Separated by 3 major blockades, Green Sun, who was far away at the border, couldn't do anything. Lawrence stretched out his hand and pulled up his sleeve, showing the complicated alchemy array on it and the huge power sealed under it. The 10 disasters have given me the miraculous imprint of the frost and hail disaster. When necessary, I won't be stingy with this power. As for more, his expression was helpless, and he smoked silently. How could there be anything more than that? If they really wanted to protect the Donbua Inner Circle, Green Sun, as a rebel organization in the realm of reflection, should stay far away from it. Even if the Alliance and Green Sun had an improper relationship, both sides had always tacitly maintained boundaries. Private transactions aside, if it really became a branch of Green Sun, there was no need for the Astronomy Association. The Gong family and the Wu family could join hands and destroy the Donbua Inner Circle as a political achievement. In the silence, everyone's face was gloomy. They wanted to laugh, but they couldn't. They would die if they resisted, and they would also die if they didn't resist. Who didn't want to laugh in such a funny situation? Everyone has supported each other for so many years. Green Sun naturally won't leave. Lawrence sighed and put out his cigarette. Although it's not appropriate to say this, the door of Canaan will always be open for you. Canaan, the lower-level blockade border. Green Sun's base camp, the nest of all the Anti-Astronomy Association forces in the realm of reflection, and the greatest threat of the Astronomy Association. If there was no way out, there was indeed a possibility of escaping to Canaan. This was destined to be the last choice. Even if they couldn't survive, they could still go to Liangshan. But once they made such a choice, it was no different from becoming Green Sunday. At that time, even if the Donbua Inner Circle could survive, as the remaining members of the Alliance, the others would definitely suffer a tragic purge. The situation that the mixed breeds faced would only be worse. After so many years of struggle, once the tide came, it would collapse like a fortress on the beach and disappear without a trace. In the gloomy atmosphere, Sheng Tianmu sat in his chair expressionlessly and looked at Huaishur, who he had brought to listen to the meeting. Huaishur sighed and raised his hand. I know that logically speaking, I shouldn't speak in a meeting between the leaders of the Alliance, but I have news. The peace order is imminent. After conveying the information from Hoop, the atmosphere in the meeting room became solemn again. 5 days later, Qian Yilong frowned. Are you sure? If it's just a groundless rumor, it's too sensational. How did you know? Under everyone's suspicious gaze, Huaishur couldn't help but shake his head and sigh tiredly. You guys just treat it as the information that I exchanged with my blood, sweat, and tears. I have already verified it through my own channels. Sheng Tianmu added, Huaishur's information is correct. In the silence, everyone was stunned for a moment. The eyes that looked at Huaishur became sympathetic and respectful. Recalling the female commissioner of Looming Hall who was rumored to have dealings with him, they seemed to have understood something. Steel wire balls, gas tanks, iron nails, leather whips, and all kinds of tragic scenes appeared in front of their eyes. Qian Yilong wanted to say something, but stopped. In the end, he raised his hand and patted him on the shoulder, encouraging and praising. Huaishur, you are a good man. It's been hard on you. He actually sold his body for the Donbua Inner Circle. Huaishur was a plain person, amazing. And the female general of the Loha family looked at Huaishur with admiration, as if she was looking at a fine jade. She didn't expect this young man to have such a unique skill in addition to killing and arson. Realizing that he had suddenly become the #1 gigolo in the Donbua Inner Circle, Huaishur rolled his eyes helplessly. He didn't know how to explain. Chapter 759. After daybreak, the news had already spread like wildfire. The alliance was not airtight. Even after many rectifications and purges, there were still traitors who slipped through the net. Moreover, Huaishur's family was not the only one who was well-informed. The other societies also had their own channels, and the grim situation was in front of everyone's eyes. Once the peace order was issued in 5 days, the order that the Donbua Inner Circle had been trying to maintain would probably face an unexpected and terrifying impact. Heavenly materials and earthly treasures belonged to those who were virtuous, and these ill-gotten gains that were like dung were the favorite of those who were not virtuous. For so many years, the foundation that the Alliance had established in the capital had attracted the attention of many people with ulterior motives. Not to mention other things, the existence of the Empire Hotel alone was enough to attract a lot of hostility. Not to mention the friction and hatred between the Alliance and the other organizations over the years. Once the peace was gone and there was a big reshuffle, Even if the Donbua inner circle remained neutral, it would still become a fat piece of meat on the chopping board. Who told you to have no backing and no status? The next morning, Huaisher stood in front of the window and saw the vast crowd on the street outside. The messy vehicles were filled with people. The crowd seemed to be fleeing for their lives. They almost blocked the streets like a colony of migrating ants. They were running away. Coward! Bastard! Bastard! Shanye's roar came from downstairs, and he was angrily scolding the team member in front of him. Have you forgotten the kindness that the boss gave you? Now you want to run away just because we're almost here? You traitor. You want to leave? Fine, cut your finger, you dog. He threw a knife in front of the team member and glared at him. Cut your finger and get out. Walk out of this door and cut all ties with the Huaisher group. Don't say that we're brothers anymore. The young team member's face was pale, and he knelt on the ground. After a long time, he grabbed the knife and pressed his hand to the ground. The others around him wanted to persuade him, but they did not dare to speak. Some people had the same idea as him and wanted to leave, but they were frightened by the punishment in front of them and did not dare to speak. A hand reached out and pressed on the young man's arm. It was the foot of the mountain. Hey, the foot of the mountain. What do you want to do? Shanye was so angry that his face was distorted. He glared at the person who stopped him. Do you have the same idea as this coward? At the foot of the mountain, he glanced at him and ignored him. He continued to look at the young man kneeling on the ground and asked, Your name is Shueihei, right? Shueihei nodded in a daze. Boss wants me to tell you something, he said. You just got married not long ago, right? Your wife is pregnant? Shanxia's words made Shueihei's face even paler. The man trembled and knelt on the ground, wanting to kowtow and beg for mercy, but was pulled up by Shanxia. Don't worry, I won't use them to threaten you. Yamashita shook his head and continued to tell him, Boss said, life is not easy, and it's even harder to be a hybrid. Men have to be responsible for their families before they can talk about loyalty and other things. You didn't run away after getting pregnant like a scumbag. It's good that you can take responsibility. Whether it's for your family or for your own life, Boss won't stop you if you want to leave. But since he had gone against the society's rules, he should not be an extreme Tao expert anymore. He should cut off his finger and find a proper job in the future. Otherwise, you know the consequences, right? At the foot of the mountains, eyes turned cold. Shueihei was stunned for a moment and nodded repeatedly. Very good. At the foot of the mountain, slowly got up, took out a ship ticket from his pocket, and threw it in front of Shueihei. This is Boss's wedding gift to you. Take it as Huaiji Group's last friendship to you. Shueihei, from now on, we are done. Shueihei was stunned for a long time. He stared at the red packet on the ground and couldn't help but cry. After a long time, he raised the knife in his hand and suddenly cut off his little finger. He didn't even bandage it. He just turned his head and kowtowed a few times in the direction of Huaisher's office. Finally, he picked up the ship ticket on the ground and turned to leave. If anyone has the same idea as him, you can say it. At the foot of the mountain, looked around at the people around him. Boss said that we can't force it. He won't stop those who want to leave Huaiji Group. Leave a finger, take the ship ticket, and leave. But only this morning. Are you all dead? Talk. Is he the only one who wants to leave? In the silence, 5 people came out one after another, picked up the knife on the ground, cut off one of their fingers as an apology, took the ship ticket, and left with gratitude or indifference. Boss Huaiji, is this really okay? Behind Huaisher, Shueihei asked, If this spreads out, I'm afraid it's not good for the unity of the group. Is unity maintained by this kind of thing? What's the use of a unity that can be broken by cutting off a finger? Huaisher shook his head and sighed softly. Let them go. At least it's a way to survive. And you, Shueihei, leave too. Shueihei was stunned and puzzled. Huaisher reached out and took out a ship ticket from his pocket and handed it to him. The ship will depart from the dock this afternoon. I've booked a first-class box for you. It can fit your whole family. Don't worry about the old furniture. After you go to White Town, take the money you've saved over the years and enjoy your retirement. Shueihei shook his head in fear. I don't want to leave. I know, but you're an old man who can't even wield a knife. What's the use of staying? Are you a burden? Huaisher asked. After you got out of prison, you haven't had blood on your hands. Now that it's time to retire, you should think about your children. This. Shuei looked blankly at the ship ticket and shook his head. Brother, this is against the rules. Rules? Huaishir shook his head and suddenly asked, Do you know what Mr. Fujimoto said to me before he died? Shuei was silent. He said, Please, Mr. Huaiji, I'll leave everyone to you. Huaishir sighed and shrugged. It's fine if you say that he's young and can fight, but he left you, an old man, to me. Did he want me to send you to fight with others? Didn't he just want you to have a good ending? I originally planned to take it slow and gradually change my name. Unfortunately, time waits for no one. Let's go, Shuei. What's the use of a cashier staying here? He's still waiting for you to hand over your work to him at the foot of the mountain. Amidst the silence, Shuei was silent. After a long time, he slowly bent down and took the ship ticket from Huaishir's hand with both hands. Thank you for taking care of me all this time. When he said goodbye, he unconsciously burst into tears. Huaishir waved his hand and watched him turn and leave. After a long time, he looked at the rushing crowd outside the window again. The time was still too short. With his current ability from last night until now, he had only booked a few smugglers' boats. It was already not easy to arrange an escape route for the people in the group. As for the people outside, he was already powerless. Where could they go? Those who had made money, changed their identities, and registered their household registration had long moved out of Donbwa Inner Circle to other cities with better security and friendlier to outsiders. As for the powerful and influential people, they could directly take their own private helicopters and hide in the best border hotels to wait for the storm to pass. And where could those people who didn't even have household registration and identity documents escape to? It didn't take long for his guesses and expectations to be confirmed. The mixed-race people who had escaped the inner circle of Donbwa didn't even have time to catch their breath before they realized that the police force on the streets of Jingdu was shockingly exaggerated. The identity checks were even stricter, especially for those with obvious mixed-race characteristics. They were stopped by the police before they could even take 2 steps. In order to live for a few more years and stay away from the abyss, those who managed to sneak into the present realm from the border had already gone bankrupt. How could they have the ability to settle their identities? As for those who wanted to hide at the border, they found that they couldn't even pass the customs. As for Yomi under the shadow of the inaction order, all parties could foresee the coming storm. In this kind of time, when they couldn't even take care of themselves, how could they spare any mercy to the mixed breeds? It didn't take long for those who gritted their teeth and abandoned their families to run away to be badly battered by the cruel reality. After learning from the mistakes of others, he dejectedly returned to the only place where he could stay. He resigned himself to fate. Woof! Just outside the inner circle of Donbwa, at the entrance of a restaurant, a girl who had just started work for the first day had just lifted the cover in front of the door when she smelled something unusual from the street. She looked at the rushing crowd in a daze. She didn't understand what was going on. Boss, something seems to have happened outside. She curiously peeped at the scene outside. Behind the counter, Ms. Jean Jiang put down the phone in her hand. She was in a daze for a long time before she sighed with melancholy. I'm sorry, Zhenshi. It's your first day, and you've already encountered this kind of thing. I'm afraid it won't be safe here from now on. Is there anywhere else you can go? Huh? Am I fired? Zhenshi was dumbfounded and immediately became nervous. Did I do something wrong? I can change. If the salary is too high, it doesn't matter if it's a little less. No, just take care of my meals. I'm very hardworking. Ms. Jean Jiang heard her and looked at the small horns on Zhenshi's forehead. She couldn't help but sigh and reach out to rub her hair. Forget it. Since you don't have anywhere else to go, just stay here. You can also accompany Tomoko, but you have to eat less. The food in the restaurant can't stand you eating like this. For the next few days, try not to go out on the street. Just stay in the restaurant. She said, the gangs on the street are going to fight. Don't get hurt by accident. I'm not afraid of that. I'm very strong. Zhenshi clenched her fist and solemnly promised, if there are bad guys, let me protect the boss and Tomoko. Okay. Looking at her naive and serious look, Ms. Jean Jiang couldn't help but laugh. She pinched her cheek and said, Then I'll leave it to you. Chapter 760. In the afternoon, Yuan Zhao slept until the sun was high in the sky before he got up. He pretended that he did not play with his phone until late last night and was about to go out to work when he was stopped. It was Yi Shuiya. Are you awake? If you're awake, come to the executive lounge and I'll give you the cake. He was shocked. This strange woman actually didn't send him out to run around and even bought him a cake to fix it. There must be a conspiracy. Yuan Zhao trembled with fear and trepidation as he carefully sat across from the table. He tasted like he was chewing wax as he ate the cake that Yi Shuiya ordered out of excitement, causing him to be unable to finish it. He did not know what was going to happen next, but what he received was an unbelievable answer. I don't need to go anymore. Yuan Zhao was stunned. That's it. Yes. Yi Shuiya nodded. After thinking about it, you've been working hard for this period of time. I might as well give you a vacation. Where do you want to go to play? Buy whatever figurines and models you want. As for your salary, it's already been sent to your card. What? Yuan Zhao was dumbfounded. He blankly looked in the direction of the inner circle of Donbua. He was puzzled. We're just going to leave it like this? Yi Shuiya poked the fruit on the banana parfait and asked back. What else can we do? The God City will be so tight in the future that we can't catch it. There are many ways to solve the problem. Why waste time on a tree? Then that group of bastards, just leave it like this. We're from Dongsha, Yuan Zhao. As a foreigner, isn't it annoying to meddle too much in the affairs of the locals? It's not like we're idols. Every time you go out, don't you feel uncomfortable being followed by a few people taking pictures? Yi Shuiya raised her head and suddenly asked, Moreover, when did we say we're going to help them? Bastards have never had anything to do with Dongsha. Don't you think there's enough trouble? Yuan Zhao was stunned. Looking at the calm woman in front of him, he could not believe it. Those are hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. How can you be so cold-blooded? I don't know if they're all innocent, but if the temperature of blood is limited, leaving it to the most important people is only natural, right? Compared to being responsible for strangers, shouldn't I be more responsible for Dongsha? Yi Shuiya chewed on the crisp and the cream and put down the fork. Since the Yingzhou officials don't care, then as bystanders, we don't have much room to intervene. Quit while you're ahead, little brat. Otherwise, you'll only sink deeper and deeper. In the end, not only will you get into trouble, but you'll also be despised by others for causing trouble. Then what are we here for? It's probably a message for some narrow-minded old man. You just need to do the chores. Yi Shuiya shrugged slightly and glanced at his watch. That's right. The current Geographical Association survey report is still at the front desk. If you have time later, help me bring it up. I have something to do, so I'll leave first. What are you going to do? Behind the table full of bread and cakes, Yuan Zhao became alert. Why didn't you bring me along? Are you going to spa for an essential oil massage too? Yi Shuiya turned her head and looked at him. Soon after, she realized, I almost forgot. You're almost at the age where you're curious about big sisters like me, but you're not my type. Yuan Zhao subconsciously wanted to retort. He wanted to say that he was not interested in Annie. But before he could open his mouth, his survival instinct took a step ahead and sent out an alarm. In the tragic hallucination of dozens of trucks coming head-on and knocking him flying, he obediently swallowed the rest of his words. With great difficulty, he squeezed out a regretful expression. That's really too bad. Good boy. Yi Shuiya withdrew her gaze with a smile that was not a smile. She turned around and left. Only when she passed by the window and saw the surging tide of people in the distance, she could not help but silently sigh. In the quiet room of the Heaven's Eye residence, the old man's face was still stuck with a Band-Aid. He threw one tragic photo after another on the table. Last night, the chivalrous past people were completely annihilated. He smoked a cigarette and sighed helplessly. How tragic. The president and the cadres were all completely wiped out. Not a single chicken or dog was spared. This time, the Iron King faction is determined to expand their power. After forming an alliance with the new G group, they're going to go all out. The K faction and the Fool's Company are together again. And the inner circle of Donbua was sandwiched between the two sides. He frowned and sighed. Back then, When you encouraged this old man to compete for the position of president, you didn't say that there would be such a thing. On the opposite side of the table, Yu Dongri, who took off his wig to fan himself, rolled his eyes. In any case, in the end, it's going to be bad. You've lived for so long. Could it be that you're still afraid of death? What's with being afraid after you've had your fill? Death is death. Fear is fear. These are two different things. Heavens, I waved his hand and looked at the opposite side. You've been here for so long, and you still haven't settled the future of the God City. This time travel of yours doesn't look that good. There's no other way. That guy's getting harder and harder to deal with. It was clearly very easy to kill him the last few times. Yu Dongri could not help but want to scratch his head. But when he thought of his hair that had been washed day by day, he suddenly became more sorrowful. Can you not count on me for everything? Without Bifrost's active cooperation, the time jump can only be a watered-down version. It's already a miracle that the inner circle of Donbua hasn't exploded on the spot. If you ask me, this has to be the fault of a certain B** start. Whenever he's involved in anything, it's easy to go wrong. The last few times this happened, I've already scattered the ashes of the God City. In the end, I've searched almost every place in the inner circle of Donbua and killed more than 80 clones, but he still managed to escape. This is F** King ridiculous. Heaven's Eye sighed helplessly and sipped his tea, before he suddenly asked, have you heard of the fraternity that's been spreading in the inner circle of Donbua recently? What's that? Yu Dongri frowned. The fraternity? The kind that I know about? That's right. Heaven's Eye nodded. It's a group of people who find a time, find a few chairs, sit in a circle, and take turns telling stories. Then everyone will cry and be filled with hope for life again, and then start over. The main idea is to help and support each other. It's very sunny and upbeat. Sounds good. Yu Dongri agreed. Do they have a hair growth support group? Introduce me. Heavens, I couldn't help but sneer. You actually think it's good? Is there a normal person in the world who would come to the inner circle of Donbua to rope in a bunch of B** stars to do good deeds? That's hard to say. You can't be too absolute. You have to believe in life and in hope. Yu Dongri shrugged and sincerely sympathized with a certain guy who had been shot in the head. We investigated the fraternity's composition and found that most of the members were a bunch of old and helpless wretches. However, someone who snuck in discovered that someone was distributing this kind of painkiller. Heavens, I raised his hand and took out a plastic box, which he placed in front of Yu Dongri. There was only a white pill inside, and it was impossible to tell where it came from. Yu Dongri frowned. Did you find out what it was? Most of it was common, with some traces of illicit drugs. It can reduce the pain slightly when complications occur, but it doesn't help at all. At best, it's just a placebo. Where did it come from? A pharmaceutical factory donated it on credit. Interesting. Yu Dongri picked up the box and tossed it up and down. I'll take a look at it later tonight. Maybe, before he could finish his sentence, his face suddenly changed and he froze on the spot. His fingers clenched so tightly that the box in his hand was almost deformed. He convulsed on the spot and almost flipped the table over. Heavens, I was stunned for a moment. After so many times, he was already prepared. Ignoring the fact that it was scalding his hand, he subconsciously grabbed his precious teapot. Immediately after, Yu Dongri vomited pitch-black blood. The blood fell on the table and made a sizzling sound. His face was pale. The sudden fluctuation of Origin's substance alerted the guards outside the door. Hurried footsteps rushed in, but Heavens, I shouted at them to stop. Don't come in. Heavens, I turned around and yelled. Nothing has happened. Everyone, return to your positions. The footsteps paused for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. When he turned around and glanced at Yu Dongri, he discovered that Yu Dongri had already climbed to his feet, pulled out a metallic pill from his pocket, and popped it into his mouth. His expression finally improved slightly. All right, there's no need to go. Yu Dongri wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and panted with difficulty. The pharmaceutical factory has been empty for a long time. It's filled with explosives. Anyone who goes in is going to die. If it weren't for the fact that I was careful, I would have been blown to death inside. That guy is getting harder and harder to deal with. The future of the divine city woke up from a nightmare. He opened his eyes, his back drenched in sweat. He had been killed once again in that nightmare, which was so realistic that it seemed almost real. He was in a laboratory that he had prepared for himself. Just as he was completely immersed in his research and breakthroughs, the door was pushed open from behind him. A person carrying a gun walked in, aimed at the back of his head, and pulled the trigger. Blood and gore splattered everywhere as he collapsed to the ground. Even his consciousness was blurred, and his experience of rapidly fading away was so real. He was dead. When he opened his eyes again, he discovered that he was still lying on his bed, and in front of him was a ceiling covered in mold and stains. It was as if everything that had just happened was just a simple dream. But this kind of dream had already appeared far too many times. Death by gunfire, decapitation, poisoning, falling objects, being tortured, accidents, and even fire and incineration. Every dream was vivid and lifelike, and the despair and fear in every dream were so real that it made one shudder. And in the countless dreams and deaths, no matter where they met, whether it was day or night, only that pair of cold and indifferent eyes were the same. This was the only thing that he remembered very clearly. That person's name was Yu Dongri. Resonance physique. A low and hoarse voice came from the darkness. Congratulations, future of the divine city. You have lived up to your name and escaped death once again. Chapter 761. Resonance Constitution. The future of God City lowered his head and looked at his hands. The corners of his mouth curled up. He didn't know if it was joy or mockery. It was hard to understand. This kind of dream talk is actually real, but where does the so-called constitution reflect? He sneered softly. Nerves? Blood type? Bones? Organs or lymph? What is the so-called resonance? A mixed race like me can also resonate with the Rainbow Bridge? Doesn't this prove that the soul of a mixed race is no different from that of an ordinary person? Exactly. The voice in the darkness replied, mortals are always scheming to divide inside and outside, level and difference. But in the eyes of our Lord, all things are equal and there is no difference. The so-called mixed race is just closer to the abyss. God City, even though you are a little extreme, you still possess wisdom. You should be able to break free from your narrow prejudice. Don't preach. The future of God City refused. I don't intend to believe in gods. It doesn't matter. The hoarse voice said, our Lord doesn't care whether you believe or not, and it won't change reality and results. Our alliance is not limited to the so-called good and evil, but for the common unity of all things. God City, you just need to remember this. God City sneered. The element of destruction longs for the unity of mankind. Is there a better joke in the world? There is. The voice said, for example, the beast of eternal life longs for death. It was hard to describe whether this strange logic was too rigid or the sense of humor was too unique. For a moment, it was difficult for God City and the future to distinguish. However, there was something wrong with trying to understand the existence of this crown with human logic. After being together for so long, God City found that his ally was not so much a devil from hell, but an AI that completely contradicted common sense. However, this was good. For a scholar like the future of God City, having a strong and powerful ally was simply a disaster. On the contrary, it was much more pleasant to work together like this. God City, you have talent. You were born this way, not only wisdom, but also ability. The voice told him, for the Astronomy Society, people like you are priceless treasures, an indispensable part of the Bifrost, a consumable in the time jump, just like you Dongri. Shen Sheng was silent for a long time and asked unwillingly, since I can feel the resonance, why can't I jump like him? The three great seals are not things that can be used just by having a constitution. You also need complicated development and surgical modification, a huge supply of energy, and the resonance of the Bifrost itself. The voice replied, however, even without development and permission, and unable to jump through time, you can still sense the fragments of the future that belong to you through Lu Dongli. In other words, He is the one who brought you the information of the future. This was the so-called resonance. Just as two tuning forks would resonate when they were close to each other, the recording of events could be transmitted in this way. Every time Yu Dongri went through a time jump, it would bring him an unforgettable death record. He could only passively obtain things from the future and avoid his original death over and over again. I can only be killed by him over and over again. God City suppressed his anger and asked in a low voice, "Am I such a comical character?" No, Divine City, you should have realized this. Every time you repeat it, you become stronger. The voice said decisively, "The time jump of the Bifrost is not omnipotent. Using it without scruples like he did is a special case. However, as long as I am here, he is destined to not cross the final boundary. Give the loser a chance to start again. But even if he starts again, he still can't change the cause of the past and the effect of the future. All he can do is to use this meaningless reincarnation to futilely delay the arrival of the end, just like a dozen years ago. The resonance system you have, my existence, and now everything in the Dambwa inner circle all prove this. If any of these conditions were missing, it would not be possible to establish such a situation. God City, fate is on your side. In the boiling darkness, a solemn and ferocious silhouette slowly emerged. It was a giant-like existence. Under the tattered black robe, 6 arms that were as thin as tree trunks spread out, showing the true essence of the abyss in a terrifying manner. The souls of the past cannot kill you. You have the future. The existence called Yushur said so decisively. It was the wearer of the destruction elemental, the rancher's crown, the spirit of hell born from all the plagues and diseases in the world, the true messenger of God. And just under the complicated limbs, there were countless tubes and equipment that connected its body and essence, combining it and the huge machine into one. Under the cold light, the embryo in the petri dish was slowly growing. In just 3 days, it had formed the embryonic form of a baby from the state of a fertilized egg, and it was even accelerating. Almost there, the future of God City stared at the sacred embryo and whispered softly, "Let the hybrid be liberated from this sad fate. Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more, brother." In the depressing atmosphere in the office of Huai Ji Commercial, Huaisher couldn't help but sigh. Looking at the 2 burly men from the Russian Federation across the table, Huaisher pounded the table bitterly, raised his hand, and gestured, "I admit that this is a very tempting price, but unfortunately it's still a little bit less than the price in my heart. Why don't you try a little harder? Otherwise, in this world, how can you let the traitor run away and not let the traitor eat grass?" The 2 men from the K party gradually became indifferent and unmoved. They just looked at Huaisher indifferently. They didn't raise their price again. Huaisher suddenly felt even more regretful. Or, introduce your corporate culture? Enthusiasm and loyalty from the Russian Federation. How beautiful the exotic scenery is, and so on. Everyone is respectful to each other and united as a family. Don't be so cold. I'm not charging you. Can I say a few more words? What answered him was a disdainful snort. Just across the table, the middle-aged man who didn't say a word after entering slowly stood up and told him, "No one can bargain with the K party, Huaisher." He said, "Either you agree or you die. That's all. Die. Here?" Huaisher smiled, pointed to his neck, and gestured a cutting gesture. "You came to my territory and came to my front. I served you tea and treated you as guests. But what about you? But you're only here to tell me to surrender, or else I'll die. Then do you want to cut off my head? Now, do you have a knife? Do you want me to lend you one?" He reached out and pulled out a wakizashi from the drawer beside him, nailed it to the table, and then hooked his finger at the 2 guests. "Come on." The other man with a tattoo on his face was furious. He stood up, but was held down by his boss. "Since you dare to refuse the big boss's mercy, then prepare to welcome the war, Huaisher." The man took off his sunglasses, revealing gray eyes covered with white clouds, and said with pity, "The so-called Ingzhou people are just like this, especially the mixed-race people. You have no fate with true honor. and you won't understand the value of loyalty. War? Huaishir was stunned and doubted his ears. You're talking to me about war? He was almost amused. Full of puzzlement and curiosity, he asked seriously, Are you declaring war on me? Gentlemen, you want to choose war? But do you really know what a real war is like? Not to mention the monstrous changes caused by the Steel Torrent and the Battle of the Pedigree, the battle between the Astronomical Society and the Golden Dawn on the Endless Sea, or even the fierce battle on the scorched earth of Australia. Just the malicious competition between the Ivory Tower and the Ivy League for a hell. Compared to those huge and terrifying battles, even the Mafia's fight for territory could be considered a war? No way. No way. Are you serious? It was like seeing a child holding a world peace card and saying, Your father used the world peace card to defeat my father, and now I'm going to use the world peace card to defeat you. Where did this child come from? That dumbfounded expression was probably mistaken for panic and fear, right? The Russian Federation people looked at him with disdain. They were about to speak, but they saw Huaishir waving his hand. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. Huaishir waved his hand and said generously, If you want to be my enemy, then come. If this is what you call a war. He held back his laughter and tried hard to squeeze out a serious expression, but the mockery could not be concealed. It was like watching a neighbor's child playing with the electric switch. As long as you're happy. The tattooed face was livid, and he was furious. He suddenly took a step forward and reached out to pull out the wakizashi on the table. He wanted to make this bastard's blood splatter everywhere. But at that moment, the wakizashi on the table seemed to suddenly disappear. Then, with a flash, it appeared again. Huaishir held the hilt of the knife in his hand, and it had already nailed the man's left hand to the table. It pierced through, and blood spurted out. A tragic scream sounded. The Russian Federation people waved their fists in anger, but Huaishir was expressionless. He just twisted the hilt of the knife slightly, and the man lying on the table twitched again. Only the sputtering blood fell on Huaishir's face, which made his handsome face look particularly ferocious. You came here with arrogance and showed me mercy. You humiliated my hospitality, trampled on my kindness, and expected me to wag my tail and beg for mercy. But from the beginning to the end, you didn't understand one thing. He stared at the middle-aged man in sunglasses and told him word by word, Your so-called honor and value have never had anything to do with me. I am above your honor, and I despise your value. Now, Huaishir pulled out the blade in his hand and put it back into the scabbard amid the screams. He said softly, You can go back and prepare for your so-called war. He said goodbye. Chapter 762. Huaishir said goodbye. So they said goodbye. Although some things that no one wanted to see happened in the middle, at least it could be considered a happy ending. In the office, watching the two people from the Russian Federation leave, Huaishir raised his hand and picked up a call from Sheng Tianmu. The people from the Russian Federation also went to your place? Huaishir smiled. They sat for half an hour and left. Isn't it a bit late for you to call now? I only called you because I know they left. Sheng Tianmu said, You should be careful these days. Before anything happens, a local conflict may start to break out. You've been in the limelight recently. If I were the people from the Russian Federation or the Iron King Party, I would definitely get rid of you first. I thought you would blame me for humiliating the emissary and stealing the limelight from you. It's okay, I just scolded the people from the Iron King Party and had a good time, I don't mind. Sheng Tianmu generously let it go. Offend the K Party and the Iron King Party at the same time? Huaishir asked, Are you serious? What else? Can kneeling down and kowtowing guarantee safety? Sheng Tianmu sighed softly. This old man will really kowtow, and I will kowtow again and again, but kowtowing is useless. Huaishir couldn't. You should be careful. I've been feeling uneasy recently. I always feel that things are not so simple. Sheng Tianmu sighed irritably. In the end, it's too difficult for a mixed race to live in the world of Yingzhou, even if they do evil. But what if they can't even survive doing evil? Huaishir was silent. After a long time, he said, There will always be a way, right? Who knows, one day at a time, it's just like that. Sheng Tianmu shook his head and didn't say anything, but finally reminded, Chi was attacked before. It was the people of the new G group. Remember to be careful. Bring more people when you go in and out. I understand. Don't worry. After hanging up the phone, Huaishir turned around and looked at the schedule hanging on the wall. Drinking water companies, fresh food markets, pharmaceutical chains, all the grand aspirations were cut short in the turmoil. Even the Huai paper group that had just taken shape was now almost falling apart. This world was always so cruel. It was so difficult to create beautiful things, but it was too easy to destroy them. Perhaps AI Qing was right to disagree with him. From the very beginning, she knew that she was wasting her time. In the silence, Huaishir tilted his head. Before he could light his cigarette, he heard a knock on the door behind him. When he said, "Come in," someone pushed the door open and came in. It was still the same suit that had been ironed countless times. The old man adjusted his glasses and looked up at him with an awkward smile. Between the houses? Huaishir's movement stopped in place, holding the lighter, stunned. "Why haven't you left yet?" Immediately, he became nervous. "Is there a problem with the ship?" "No. The ship to White Town has already set sail. My wife took my son-in-law's family there first and didn't find me sneaking down." Between the houses smiled embarrassedly. "My daughter seemed to be very angry. She just called me and scolded me. I'm so old, it's so embarrassing. But there's no other way. When I think that the guy at the foot of the mountain is in charge of the accounts, I can't rest assured. That guy never writes a receipt when he goes out to eat. Besides, after everything is settled, someone has to do the accounts to avoid taxes, right? What if someone embezzles? Why paper boss? You never look at the reports. You have to have a trustworthy person to keep an eye on it." Huaishir was stunned and didn't speak. Between the houses, he didn't know what to say. After a long time, he raised his hands to comb his mottled hair, bent down, and solemnly reported, "I'm back, dear." After a long time of astonishment, Huaishir couldn't help laughing loudly. He reached out to hug him and patted his back vigorously. "Welcome back, Between the Houses." There was no news more pleasant than this. The return of the house injected a shot of confidence into the low morale of the Huai paper group. Even the 47-year-old treasurer had already planned to roll up his sleeves and fight with everyone. The group members, who were originally in a daze and uneasy, also calmed down a lot. On the contrary, Between the Houses began to have a headache. They had just been away for half a day, and the guy at the foot of the mountain had made a mess of his accounts. The accounts didn't match at all. Between the houses, he was so angry that his eyes turned red. He began to pull the receipts and invoices from the foot of the mountain one by one. Even through the door, he could hear the angry roar from the foot of the mountain. "Isn't it just 20? It's not 2 million. I'll take out the money myself. Here, give me 9,980. You bastard, don't look down on the treasurer." Between the houses, he slammed the table and roared, "I'll give you 2 million, but you have to settle this 20 yuan account for me. Also, why should the lunch of the group be included in the reception fee? Do you know the words meal allowance, idiot? I didn't graduate from high school, so I don't know. Come and chop me, come on." In short, it was very lively. The group members also breathed a sigh of relief. Although the people who stayed didn't waver much because of the people who left the group, after an entire day of oppressive atmosphere, they now felt inconceivably relaxed. Under the shadow of the Nothing Order, there were about 20 people who left. This number was less than Huaishir had expected, but Huaishir didn't count those who made up the numbers. The official members of the Huai paper group were only about 200 people. It couldn't even be considered a medium-sized enterprise. However, it was still quite convenient to manage. There was the Bone Burial Sanctuary to check the favorability, value, and loyalty at any time, so there was no need to worry about the traders. The traders who dared to come to the Huai paper group were basically all turned over by Huaishir. The rest who were really sinful could only be suddenly infected with a strange abyss disease and sent to the ICU for 10 days. With the support of a large group, they could avoid losses to the greatest extent during the Nothing Order. When the time came, when all this was over, he could start the plan again. Just as he leaned on the chair and thought about the next arrangement, he heard the noise downstairs suddenly stop for a moment, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Shanya didn't even have time to knock on the door before pushing it open and entering. He looked nervous. "Boss, it's not good. Look at the TV. What's wrong? Why are you suddenly so nervous?" Huaisher rummaged for a long time before finding the remote control and turning on the TV. Just as he was about to ask which channel it was on, he saw the scene of the cooking program on the Kyoto TV station suddenly tremble. Then an emergency news was broadcast. At the scene of a major traffic chain accident in the Dombwa district of Kyoto, under the viaduct, thick smoke rose from the toppled oil tanker. As the helicopter swooped down, there was another violent explosion. The flowing gasoline spread around with flames, igniting the houses next to it. The firefighting vehicles continued to spray water jets, but they couldn't extinguish the flames. There were cries and shouts. The children who were rescued from the fire were still calling for their parents, but no one responded in the noise. And just as the camera was filming, Huaisher saw the wreckage of a car next to the burning oil tanker under the thick smoke. There was also the logo of the Alliance on it. That was Shengtenma's car. Yesterday, he drove that car to visit the general, but today it was hit by an oil tanker and exploded? What about Shengtenma? What about the old man who called him half an hour ago? As his phone vibrated, an email from Akasaki Makoto popped up. The president was attacked. Hurry to Kashihara. Huaisher cursed and jumped up from the chair. He grabbed his coat from the hanger and said, "Shanya, get the car. We're going to hospital." Shanya didn't say anything and simply took the car keys to start the car. In less than a minute, a car sped out from the back alley of Huai-ji Commercial and rushed to the Kashihara hospital built and operated by the Alliance. On the way, Huaisher called Akasaki. "What's the situation?" The oil tanker was hit. Fortunately, the president was cautious and had Tamada-san with him. Otherwise, he would have been in trouble. But he was still affected by the explosion and is now undergoing surgery. The specific situation is still unclear. Who did it? It should be the work of the K-Party. Once the soft approach doesn't work, those Russians will throw away all pretenses and resort to explosive attacks. Akasaki suppressed his anger and reminded him, "Be careful. Since they have already launched an attack, they definitely won't let it go." "I know." Huaisher looked up and said, "I already saw it." In the rearview mirror, there were suddenly 4 motorcycles speeding over. The riders were wearing motorcycle jackets and black helmets. Behind the black masks, there was malice and ferocity. Regardless of the busy downtown, the person at the front took out a pistol from his pocket, aimed at the car, and pulled the trigger. Unfortunately, the car that he borrowed from the old man Shengtenmo was fully bulletproof, so this kind of small caliber pistol was useless. Immediately after, someone stepped on the gas pedal and sped up. He pulled out an axe from his backpack and slashed at the window next to Huaisher with all his might. Huaisher glanced at him indifferently and retracted his gaze. Then, Ueno suddenly turned the steering wheel, and the whole heavy car squeezed to the right, directly squeezing the person who rushed up against the wall. Amidst the violent collision and scraping, no trace of him could be seen. The speeding car suddenly shook as if it had run over something. Behind it, the rapidly rolling and spinning motorcycle smashed into the entrance of the tunnel, setting off a ball of fire. However, there were still some fearless attackers who rushed forward. The fastest one raised his hand and took out a heavy object from his backpack. There were suction cups on it. He raised his hand and was about to place it on the car window. But then, the car window shattered. The drummer shook and instantly broke the thick bulletproof glass from the inside. Then, a hand stretched out from inside like an iron clamp and pinched the wrist holding the bomb. The 5 fingers slowly tightened. With the crisp sound of bones breaking, the attacker let out a tragic scream and struggled with all his might, but his weak wrist could not break free from the clamp. He even began to be dragged away. "Since fate has brought us together, why don't we hitch a ride?" Through the cracked mask, Huaisher looked at the face outside the window that was gradually contorting in fear and smiled. "Ueno, speed up." Then, Ueno grinned and stepped on the accelerator. The car began to speed up. Together with the attacker, there was a hoarse scream in the wind outside the window. The motorcycle under the attacker shook rapidly, unable to keep up with the speed. Finally, it lost control and broke free from the attacker's body. It rolled and hit the wall of the tunnel, exploding. And the heartwarming ride had just begun. Chapter 763. It was a short 4-minute journey, but it felt like 48 hours. At first, there were screams and curses, but later, the pain became unbearable. They fought back with all their might, slashing with their swords, biting with their teeth, and struggling with all their strength, even if they would be crushed under the wheels after they regained their freedom. In the end, the curses turned into hoarse pleading and disappeared. The rag-like thing hanging outside the car window stopped making any sound. It just quietly followed the laws of physics, rubbing against the ground, leaving a red road sign that gradually dried up for the pursuers behind. Unfortunately, after leaving such an eye-catching mark, the active figures on the motorcycles could no longer be seen, until the cars slowly stopped in the underground parking lot of Kashiwabara Hospital. The nurses who received the report from the front door rushed over with a stretcher, but they didn't see the expected wounded. All he saw was a wobbly object hanging from the car window. Then his 5 fingers slowly loosened. Throwing the thing on the ground, Huaisher opened the door from the outside and got out of the car. Akaki, who had just arrived, was stunned. Looking at the bloody attacker under Huaisher's feet, she asked, "Who is this?" "A friend I met on the road." Huaisher answered and shook the stains on his hands. "We happened to be on the same road, so I gave him a ride." "Look, aren't we at the hospital? Quick, send him to the ICU." Lifting his foot and stepping over the wriggling attacker on the ground, Huaisher walked to the operating room under the guidance of his allies. In the private elevator, Huaisher asked Akaki, who had arrived earlier, "What's the specific situation?" "I don't know too much for now. The driver failed to be resuscitated a few minutes ago and passed away." Ignoring the no-smoking rule in the elevator, Akaki smoked a cigarette irritably. "The president was originally fine, but he's old. I don't dare to ask too much about the specific details." At this kind of time, the most important thing for an ally's subordinate to do was to sit down and wait for orders and reports from the higher-ups. Those who asked around were all people with ulterior motives. The fact that he could know so much was already the treatment of a trusted subordinate. As soon as the elevator door opened, she saw Qian Yirenjir leaning against the window and making a call. Qian Yi longer turned around and saw Huaisher. He waved at him and said a few words into the phone before hanging up. Then, he raised his head and said, "The old man is in the emergency room. I'm afraid his condition is a little troublesome." He opened the window to ventilate the stuffy corridor and disperse the lingering smell of smoke. He's already over 60 years old. It's already not easy for a half-breed who isn't an ascendant to live this long and to encounter something like this. It's a bit dangerous this time. Moderate burns were easy to deal with, but complications that had been suppressed with various drugs were difficult to deal with. No one knew when they would wake up from their coma. Qian Yi stubbed out her cigarette and asked, "Did anything happen on the way here? Have a safe trip and entertain a group of guests," Huaisher replied. "What about the others?" Qian Yi shrugged. "That's tough. There's another one who arrived right after you and was just sent to the ICU. I hope you don't mind that he took a guest bed." This joke had no effect. Neither of them was able to laugh. Qian Yi's phone vibrated again, interrupting their interest in continuing their conversation. "Take a seat first." Qian Yi patted him on the shoulder. "We'll see how it goes after the surgery." He turned and left. The atmosphere in the corridor was solemn. The backbone of the alliance sat on the benches on both sides. Their expressions were cold and serious. No one could relax to the point of laughing. However, when they saw Huaisher enter, they couldn't help but stand up and bow. Naturally, some people obediently gave up their seats and invited him to take a seat. After a long time of reshuffling his family's business, no one in the alliance dared to look down on him anymore. Even this leader, Huaisher's reputation had become mighty and heroic. Even the guardian Tian Tian, who had a transcendent position in the alliance at the entrance of the operating room, raised his eyes and glanced at Huaisher. He nodded in acknowledgement. He was still wearing the somewhat old Ingzhou robe, accompanied by a sword that never left his body. There were still traces of burn marks on his cuffs. Huaishir bowed respectfully to show his respect. Then, he sat down surrounded by the other team leaders. However, he didn't feel any pride in his heart. On the contrary, it was filled with heavy pressure. It was obvious that the situation was already on the verge of getting out of control. The news of the no matter order had just spread and hadn't taken effect yet, but the Kyoto was about to start a full-scale war. They didn't even hesitate to cause a chain car accident in the downtown area, causing major traffic accidents. When the bottom line was broken once, it would become lower and lower in the endless revenge until it finally disappeared without a trace. In a final analysis, talking about the bottom line and morality of the Kyoto was as ridiculous as talking about the risk of entering the market for leaks. Sheng Qianmu had made almost perfect preparations, but what he didn't expect was that the other party would be so crazy as to use a large oil tank to crash in the city. There were probably other explosives and attackers at the scene. The final chain car accident was just a cover-up. As soon as the storm clouds hung in the sky, the rats began to drive their warships to kill each other. Under the manipulation of all parties, the useless scum abandoned by society could be used for their final use. In the silence, his phone suddenly vibrated. He lowered his head to take a look, only to see that it was an unfamiliar number. After being stunned for a moment, Huaishir got up and walked through the corridor all the way to the rooftop before answering the phone. "Hello? Who is it? What do you think?" There was an angry voice on the other end. Ever since he became the head of the family, his stinky sister's temper had grown. She looked at everyone as her younger brother, which made Huaishir feel more and more helpless. Huaishir sighed. Don't rush me. I'm doing it. The situation is so sensitive now. Can't we wait until things are a little clearer before dealing with the Iron King gang?" "That's what I wanted to tell you." Koopa suppressed his irritation and couldn't help but have a headache. After a moment of silence, he said straightforwardly, "Huaishir, leaving Zhou." "I've already transferred the money to you. The Yuji treasure that I promised you has already been sent to the Ivory Tower. Forget about the Iron King gang. Just pretend that the deal between us didn't exist." Koopa said, "This time, the no matter order isn't that simple. Your identity is sensitive, so it's best not to get involved." Huaishir was stunned and frowned. "Say more. I like hearing this. Don't you realize that the timing of the no matter order isn't right?" Koopa sighed softly. "I can see it now. High Emperor wants to use this consumption tax reform to decide the victor between him and the general before the 5 permanent members of the Command Bureau begins. He wants to avoid the influence of the Central American lineage in the upcoming War of Worlds to the greatest extent. If things go wrong, the streets of the capital will probably return to how they were during the Fall Curtain. There will be people everywhere, and no one will be able to stay safe. Then what about the inner circle of Donbua?" Huaishir asked. "Of course they'll be sacrificed." Koopa sighed. "Do you think that a group of illegal immigrants can have any proper status? There are many people who want to take this opportunity to clean up the capital." In the silence, Huaishir's eyes widened in disbelief. He couldn't understand. What does this count for? Huaishir suppressed his anger. What does this count for? A decision that involves an entire country is decided by the results of a group of extreme Tao cultivators? In the end, they still have to use the corpses of a group of innocent people as decoration. Don't you think that's funny? Huaishir, don't forget, this is Yingzhou. Not every country can be like Dongxia, Koopa said. When internal sovereignty has already been divided to such an extent, it's already the result of everyone's efforts to restrain themselves that it hasn't become 2 countries, like Xinluo. Huaishir sneered. Are you really not afraid that the lowly people in your eyes will be driven to desperation? In the silence, Koopa's tone became complicated. Isn't there still an astronomy meeting? For the first time, Huaishir had the urge to crush his phone. On the other end, Koopa was also silent. After a long time, she sighed faintly. Forget it. I knew you would be like this. It's useless to say anything. She was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, the Iron King gang might attack the inner circle of Donbua tonight. Sheng Tianmu caused Dajin Guangzhou to be so humiliated. He won't let go of this opportunity. When Sheng Tianmu was attacked in the morning, he immediately took a set of border relics from the looming hall's channel. I know, thank you. I owe you. Without waiting for Huai Shi to speak again, she hung up the phone first. In the midst of the busy tone, Huai Shi heard hurried footsteps coming from behind the door, and the first good news of the day. Mr. Huai Shi, the president is awake. In the ward, the atmosphere was solemn. Only Sheng Tianmu, whose left arm was still wrapped in bandages, was drinking water with a smile, as if the person who had narrowly escaped death was not him. What's wrong? You look so worried. He put down a glass of water. Am I not fine? It's just a broken arm, a trivial burn. It's not like I lost my life. Why are you so worried? He waved his hand casually and laughed softly. However, this time, it's literally a fire burning at our doorstep. It seems that some people don't want us to be at peace. Huai Shi, who had just walked in, did not waste time and said bluntly, Tonight, the Iron King gang may launch an attack. As soon as the words came out, the atmosphere in the room suddenly stagnated, and everyone's face became ugly. No matter who it was, they would not be happy to be treated as a soft persimmon, let alone this group of extreme Tao who hung their heads on their waistbands. Only Sheng Tianmu was still calm. He nodded slightly and suddenly laughed. Then, Mr. Huai Shi, can you share my worries? It's just a small matter. Huai Shi said, It's not a problem. In the bone burial sanctuary, the crows that had been silent for a long time let out excited cries, and a cruel light burst out from their scarlet eyes. Chapter 764. In the silent night, the distant Empire State Building glowed with neon lights. In the front passenger seat, Huai Shi opened his eyes and took a look. What time is it? 11:30. Shang Ye said, Boss, do you want to rest? No need. I'll just lie down for a while. Huai Shi shook his head. After all, he was an ascender. It was fine to stay up for a few nights without sleep. The rest, just now, was just a habit of being cautious before the big battle. Ever since he became an ascender, it had been a long time. After going through so many battles, he didn't put the Iron King faction in his eyes. If it was Huai Shi, it should have been like this. But when he gave up the name of Huai Shi and became a mixed breed in the inner circle of Dongbua, he realized that he didn't know what to do with his strength. In one storm after another, he tried his best to climb to his current position, but he still couldn't control himself. For mixed breeds, the world was covered by layers of nets. No matter how hard they struggled, they would find that the narrow world in front of them was just a new cage. Sheng Tianmu tried, but he failed. Qian Yi and Long Air tried, but he gave up. Divine City Future also tried, but he left in a sorry state. What about himself? Would he repeat the same mistake? He sighed silently and didn't say anything. In the driver's seat, Shang Ye flipped through the convenience store bag in his hand. He held the beer and didn't know if he should hand it over. After a long time, he still didn't say anything. He gently closed the bag and rolled down the window. The slightly cold night wind blew in from the window. Even though they were far away, Huai Shi could still feel the restlessness and uneasiness in the inner circle of Dongbua. It wasn't an illusion or a guess. It was a feeling in the literal sense. It was the sadness from the miracle of young Master Ming. The destiny was in turmoil. As the young Master Ming who protected the children and the growth of the race, this miracle that was bestowed with divinity could feel the bleakness in the inner circle of Dongbua. It overflowed with sadness and pity. The cool night wind blew in from the window, waking him up from his thoughts. He rubbed his face and asked, Do you have a cigarette? Yes. Oh no. Shang Ye searched his pocket for a long time and only found an empty box. Why didn't you bring more? Shang Ye was stunned for a long time, and his expression was blank. Boss, didn't you say that smoking is bad and we should smoke less? I only brought half a box. Should I go buy another pack? Forget it. I'll smoke less. Huai Shi waved his hand and smiled helplessly. Is it about what happened during the day, boss? Wenno was still thinking about what happened after he left the hospital during the day. He sent Huai Shi to the place where the oil tanker exploded. The burning house was not completely extinguished. After a few splashes of water, the fire brigade and the TV station reporter left. The spreading flames jumped on the charred building. There were many earthquakes in Yingzhou, and the bungalows were mostly made of wood, so they burned very quickly. Not long after, only a few embers were left in the vast expanse of whiteness. At that time, Winnow was in the car. He only saw Boss Huai Ji get out of the car and come back after a while. Then, his expression was calm until now. Sometimes, he would even be absent-minded for a long time. Huaisher looked back in confusion, as if he had not heard what he had just said. Is it about what happened during the day? Winnow asked. During the day, boss, after you went there, you've been like this since you came back. Are you really an idiot? Huaisher shook his head and sighed. Winnow shrugged. Because boss always writes everything on his face. Huaisher smiled bitterly. After a long silence, he said, during the day, I went there. To be honest, I just wanted to help a little. In the end, he was not able to help. When the fire spread, Huaisher realized that he was alone and could not help at all. He could only watch the fire spread and burn more than a dozen old houses. An old woman with a head full of white hair held a young child and cried silently on the street. The muddy tears fell into the ashes and stained the cracked cement with a wisp of grayish black. The people who had hurriedly escaped stood on the street and looked blankly at the scene of their houses being burned down. However, they were not afraid. Their expressions were dull and calm, as if nothing had been lost. Huaisher lowered his head and looked at the old woman who was crying so hard that she could not make a sound. I wanted to protect them, Winnow. Huaisher sighed silently. I told her, don't be afraid. There will be people from the Huai Ji group coming to help. At the very least, they will be able to find you a temporary place to stay. With us around, we will protect you. Those people will not come back, and this will not happen again. But no one paid me any attention. Only the old woman looked up with her empty eyes, full of indifference and resentment. She lost her husband because of the armed fight, her son because of the forbidden drugs, and her last home because of the sudden fire. She had been tortured by the suffering of the inner circle of Donbua for her whole life. She had long become numb and used to it. In the end, it had become an irreplaceable contempt. The old woman looked at Huaisher's face indifferently. Every time Huaisher closed his eyes, he could recall that pair of muddy eyes and her hoarse words. She asked me, what's the difference between you and them? In the long silence, Huaisher closed his eyes tiredly. I actually don't know how to answer her. They were both extreme Tao, and they were all scum. Was there a difference? They could not live under the sun, and they could not live in places where the sun could not shine. From the beginning to the end, the weak and powerless could only endure the pain. Everyone demanded it. To them, what was the difference between the alliance that dominated them, the plain Huai Ji group in front of them, their so-called compatriots, and the gangs outside the inner circle of Donbua? In the silence, Winnow looked at Huaisher in shock. He could not help but scratch his head. You can't say that, right? He thought for a long time and said seriously, actually, there's a difference. I think there's a big difference. It's just that we F***CK. He could not understand those messy things at all. When he was anxious, he spoke incoherently. In the end, he angrily hammered his own head and gave up thinking. He just said firmly, at least, boss is different from the others. Huaisher was amused. It's just less protection money. Anyone can do that, right? It's not the same. Winnow hesitated for a long time before speaking again. Boss, I don't really understand what you said to me before. It's about extreme Tao and rats falling into the sea. To be honest, I don't understand it all. He thought for a while and said seriously, but even if it's a ship made of rats, other than fighting with other ships, it can still allow more people to live, right? If it was Huai Ji group, he could definitely do it. Winnow believed in this almost blindly. He believed in everything he did even more than Huaisher. Growing up in the inner circle of Donbua, even the most simple-minded mixed breed could understand his own insignificance, the ugly way of life, and the original sin that he was born with. Betrayal, killing, fighting, plundering, and deception. He had long been used to it, until one day, a person descended from the sky and proved to him that everything could be different. Even mixed breeds could hold their heads high and live in this world with dignity. It It was like an unattainable dream. A flame lit up in the darkness. It's not just me. Everyone in Huaiji group believes in this, Winnow said with certainty. Shanya said with certainty, if someone says that he doesn't believe what boss says, then he must be lying. After a long silence, Huaishir raised his head and looked at his subordinate beside him. He sighed in surprise. Winnow, you're surprisingly good at talking. Really? Winnow widened his eyes in disbelief. Yes. Huaishir held back his laughter and nodded seriously. Maybe he really has the talent to be a teacher. I think at least he'll have no problem being a physical education teacher. Really? Huaishir didn't answer. He only raised his hand and patted him on the shoulder. Thank you, Winnow. He said, thank you for believing in me so much. Winnow grinned. He was excited and happy like a proud shark. In the distance, waving lights came from the darkness. The scouts in front had sent out a predetermined signal. Then, high-pitched horns burst forth, one after another, spreading in the darkness. It was like the whistle of a giant steel ship. Car lights lit up one after another, converging into a sea of lights, illuminating everything. Let's go, Winnow. Huaishir stared at the birds flying across the sky. He said, we're going to set sail. 15 minutes ago, in the dead silent parking lot, a loud and powerful declaration was heard. The priest of Yamaguchi Shrine said that I'm a general who built his success on the bones of 1,000 soldiers. I don't believe it. I think that when you're out in the world, you have to decide whether you live or die. The president of the Iron King faction, Yamamasa Kosho, was holding a gorgeous long sword. He strolled in the formation in front of him and made a bold speech. Although these words sounded ominous, the extreme Taoists who lived on the edge of their blades didn't care about this at all. Their eyes were already red from the encouragement and rewards from their superiors. They rubbed their palms and couldn't wait. Right in front of him were the elites specially selected from the Iron King faction for this surprise attack. There were a total of 141 people. More than 10 of them were ascendants, and the rest were ruthless extreme Taoists who could fight against 10 people at once. Not to mention, there were also precious relics from the looming mansion. As he clapped his hands, the subordinates behind him respectfully stepped forward and presented the heavy flagpole with both hands. On top of the simple flagpole was an ancient military flag. It was unknown how many years had passed, but it had already turned yellow and was covered in dried blood. The moment the flag was unfolded, the evil spirits hidden on the flag almost jumped out of the darkness, and a ferocious aura spread out. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a blood-red light and sprinkled on everyone's head. Under the shroud of the source substance projection, everyone's face became ferocious and violent, as if an army of evil spirits from the underworld had arrived. This is the Zhongkue horse seal passed down by Lord Hondo, the god of war under Lord Tokugawa. Yamamasa Kosho laughed excitedly. With the help of this military flag, those bastards are nothing but chickens and pottery dogs, unable to withstand a single blow. Tsushima-kun, I bestow it to you. I hope your martial arts will prosper. I also hope that you can help me pacify the world like how Lord Hondo assisted Lord Tokugawa. I will certainly not disappoint the president. Yamamasa Kosho was overjoyed. He held the Zhongkue horse seal with both hands and carefully put away this powerful force. Very good. With a fierce general like Tsushinkan and an expert like Mr. Hasegawa secretly helping us, we will definitely succeed this time. I wish you all a pleasant journey. Yamamasa Kosho grinned and grinned. I will wait here for you and the head of the old thief Tenmu to return together. As the wine was drunk, the roar of the engine burst out from the parking lot. In the roar, the traffic rushed like a long dragon, rushing into the inner circle of Donbua. In the traffic, in a particularly luxurious car, Yamamasa Kosho, who had just been entrusted with a heavy responsibility, respectfully saluted the young man beside him. This time, I will rely on Mr. Hasegawa to take care of this operation. What are you talking about? It's my duty. Hasegawa Kosho smiled reservedly. Now that we have a thunderous attack, the defense in Kashihara Hospital is empty. The only one who could be my opponent is Tenda. Everyone just needs to defend and leave the rest to me. Yamamasa Kosho was overjoyed. With Mr. Hasegawa Kosho, this battle will definitely succeed. All the way, there was no obstruction. In the quiet night of Kyoto, vehicles came and went, but under the cover of Hasegawa Kosho's source substance, the convoy was shrouded in shadows. It couldn't be seen clearly from 100 steps away. Only a vague gray mist could be seen roaming between the cities, like a giant python out of its nest. In the middle of the convoy, Hasegawa Kosho closed his eyes and took a nap, but his mind and consciousness spread in all directions with the gray mist, overlooking everything around him, leaving no clues. Only the blackbirds passing by in the sky would occasionally visit curiously, staring at what was happening on the ground. The Hybrid Alliance really didn't have any vigilance. I'm afraid they were already scared out of their wits, right? Once the headquarters Tenmu fell into a coma, they would be leaderless. Now, they were probably fighting for power internally. In the distance, the security of the inner circle of Donbua was also sparse, and there was no defense at all. It's just that I don't know why Hasegawa Kosho's brows frowned. Are there more crow today? Tsujima raised his head blankly and looked out of the window, only to see the shadows hovering above the sky, scarlet eyes overlooking the earth, making noises from time to time. But the further they went, the closer they got to the inner circle of Donbua, the more crow there were. In the end, crimson brilliance appeared in every eave, every street lamp, and every shade of the trees. The wings with iron brilliance were unfolded and mockingly shrieked. The mighty crow, tide, suddenly swept, covering the entire sky. Wait, this is... Tsujima Daimu's eyes widened, and then he heard a loud roar. The whole earth suddenly shook, and the galloping convoy in front suddenly stopped. In the darkness, two mournful car lights suddenly lit up. It was as if a sleeping monster had been awakened, and the engine made a loud noise. In the roar, it rushed out, whistling forward, swaying its huge body, breaking the oncoming wind, and went straight to the galloping convoy. That was a huge oil tanker. In the darkness, the smoking man pressed the button in his hand. Oh no! Tsujima Daimu subconsciously clenched his fist, and then he saw the terrible flame rising into the sky. The terrible pressure set off white waves, sweeping and violently spreading in the quiet night of the suburbs. The blazing flame danced with the fire rain falling from the sky, sprinkling the fire of purgatory. In this sudden explosion, the gasoline and insignificant metal fuel contained in it were all converted into burning heat and spread in all directions. In an instant, 1/3 of the convoy was engulfed, and the sticky flowing flame was still spreading rapidly, engulfing all the scrapped vehicles that had no time to escape. So, in the fire, shrill screams and cries sounded. In the excited overlook of the crow, a figure slowly emerged in the burning fire. Out of the darkness, through the burning flame and the terrible heat, it was as if a real devil had walked out of his own hell, crushing the red-hot steel and charred bones as he walked forward step by step. From the fire of purgatory, a happy face showed. "Oh, everyone, good evening." Huaisher stretched out his hand, slowly pulled out the famous sword given by Tenmu, and greeted with a smile. "Did you miss me?" Chapter 765. No one responded. No one wanted to see him here, and some people didn't even know who this person was. But looking at the undisguised horns on his head, they knew that he was a member of the Hybrid Alliance. At the moment when Tsushima Daigu understood, he felt an indescribable anger, and then he felt cold all over and almost trembled. The other party came here, which proved that their actions today had already been known by them. The odds were stacked against them. What was more serious was that there was a mole in the Iron King gang. Tsushima Daigu never dreamed that the mole was not in this group of people today, nor in the Iron King gang, but in the looming hall behind the Iron King gang. But even if he trembled with anger, it was useless. In the flames of the explosion, the evil spirit who pulled out the sword stepped forward step by step and introduced himself with a smile. belonging to the Alliance, the White Paper Man. I'm here to send you on your way. In his hand, the famous saber forged by a famous blacksmith revealed layers of scale-like patterns that shone on everyone's faces. It was cold to the heart. Rotten wrote Muramasa. Among the many collections of Simu, this was still a rare sword. Even if it had not been integrated with the power of hell and became a border relic, it still had rare sharpness and hardness. In Ingzhou, the so-called rotten rope meant snake. The knife craftsman who forged it made a mistake at the time of worship and did not welcome the white snake spirit, so it became an empty shell. But for Huaishur, this empty shell was more convenient than any border relic. Now, as his wrist turned, a ray of blood spread from the sword. Just like countless scarlet pupils in the crow tide, an indescribable fierceness and resentment emerged from it. A fierce sword full of curses and hunger. As Huaishur waved his wrist, he easily tore the burning basket in front of him. In this way, he went deep into the encirclement. A low voice rose in the flames, and the undisguised third stage aura spread. Good times are always short. He asked curiously, "Do you want to come one by one, or go together? What era is it? Will anyone come to fight in front of the battle?" In his fury, Tsushima Daigu sneered. Such an idiot who dared to fight in front of the battle should have been burned to death. He slowly raised the heavy banner in his hand. The demon banner suddenly unfurled amidst the flames. The secret technique from the Yellow Springs was activated, instantly bringing about a qualitative change in the origin substance. It was rumored that War God Hondo's Zhongkue horse seal had descended upon the Yellow Springs. Along with the addition of the horse seal, a frenzied fluctuation spread out. Needless to say, those elite extreme Daos launched their attack without a word, instantly surrounding him. The ascendants at the front didn't waste any time and attacked ruthlessly. A whistling sound broke through the air. The people behind them took out all kinds of light firearms from their cars and aimed at Huaishur, waiting for him to reveal a flaw. "Why are you still playing one-on-one? Times have changed." But then, the person at the front suddenly stopped. His ferocious head silently slid down from his shoulder, and blood splattered everywhere. There was no back and forth, nor was there any clumsiness. The figure holding the sharp blade moved forward, as if he was cutting the weeds in front of him. He easily cut all the figures who dared to block in front of him into two halves. Clean and neat beheading. Then, in a loud sound of gunfire, he casually waved the blade. His reflexes, which were beyond the imagination of ordinary people, had already keenly sensed the direction of the bullet before his finger pulled the trigger, bathed in the rain of metal. Huaishur raised his head and looked at the banner in Tsushima Daigu's hand. The corner of his eyes slightly raised. "Do you have a flag?" He sighed in surprise and nodded, saying, "What a coincidence, this thing. I have it too." In that instant, the shadow under his feet suddenly spread. In a mournful light of the fire, a wisp of pitch black quietly appeared in the dancing crimson. It was like an open door, revealing the fleeting and ferocious silhouette within. There was also a burning solemn banner. The power of the bone-bearing sanctuary was operating here. The invisible force rolled up the crows all over the sky, making the dark tide surge. Then, dazzling lights lit up from the darkness in all directions. In the places where the fire couldn't reach, the doors opened one after another. The members of the Huai paper group, who had been waiting for a long time, rubbed their hands and showed the same excited smile as Huaishur. The scarlet light flowed in their eyes, as if they were integrated with the crows. Under the miracle of young Master Ming, they had become the incarnation of the abyss in the human world. Their skin had an iron glow, and the long or short katana in their hands glowed with resentment. Tonight, Huaishur transferred more than half of the core of the Huai paper group, a total of 50 people here. The Heaven's Inquisition Road had bestowed this immense power to each and every one of them. The hybrids themselves were closer to the abyss than ordinary people. They didn't feel any discomfort at all. Instead, they felt more comfortable. There were even 4 people who were particularly compatible with the crows. Their entire eyes had turned into the color of silver, Tashima Dao looked around and felt cold all over. Not only was he surprised by the strength of this hybrid alliance, but he was also afraid of the fanatical expression on those gradually approaching faces. Holy, just like the fanatical believers cultivated by the Illuminati cult, those people's eyes burned with crazy flames. They didn't need to be ordered at all. With a loud roar, they rushed forward recklessly. The power of the steel crows collided with the blessing of journey to the underworld in an instant. The flames on the flag in the bone-burying sanctuary burned more and more vigorously. But the Zhong Kuei horse seal in Tashima Dao's hand felt a majestic force descending, and it shook wildly. If at this time, with the fierce attack of the Huai paper group and a gust of wind, maybe it would really be like the ancient military confrontation, even the flagpole would be blown away in the collision of the source substance. Tashima turned back without thinking and looked behind him. Hagitsukawa-san. But Nagitsukawa-san's figure had already rushed forward under the wind. From his hand, the projection of a long spear slowly emerged. After the fragments of the dragonfly cut were recast, it was still an out-and-out divine weapon. On the body of the spear wrapped in crystal red, it was a key gun that looked like a cross. The wonderful spear, inherited from the new heavenly flow, instantly broke through the air toward Huaishur. The distance of 1,000 miles was crossed in an instant, but Huaishur moved forward as if he didn't see it. In the flames behind him, a cold light suddenly emerged, crossed the void, and slashed obliquely. From the combination of the sword heart and sword substance, the unreasonable sword chi condensed and formed. It came across the air, attacking the enemy. Nagitsukawa-san's figure suddenly stopped for a moment, and he suddenly took a step back. Amidst the raging flames, a slanted crack had already appeared. Under the sharpness of the blade, even the invisible flame was cut in two. As the upper flame dissipated, the raging flames below could not break through the invisible barrier. This was the invisible sword that he had comprehended after listening to the Sword Saint's teachings for 10 years. Even if the Sword Saint snorted in disdain and saw it as a petty trick, it was still enough to frighten even ghosts and gods. The crisp sound of wooden clogs on the ground spread. The Alliance Guardian, Amada Masahito, walked out of the fire, expressionless. Only the simple long sword in his hand was lingering with a substantial killing intent. He disdained to have any conversation with the enemy. One step cut. Taijima Dao's expression was distorted. He didn't expect that at this time, Seem Timo would be willing to send the Alliance Guardian to protect his life. Then, the mournful blood spread in front of his eyes. "Hey, where are you looking?" A smiling face appeared in front of him. Taijima Dao's expression didn't have time to change. His body subconsciously pulled out the 10 hands in his sleeves to block the blow that was going to stab his throat. Then his hair stood up, and he felt that his neck was cold. He was almost beheaded. Seeing the tragic cut on the 10 hands that he had used for many years, Taijima Dao didn't even have time to feel distressed. He subconsciously activated the power of the Zhong Kuei horse seal. After a long time, the banner that had followed the Ingzhou army god for many years not only symbolized the great achievements of the Tokugawa clan in unifying the world, but also ushered in a sublimation. If it wasn't the Zhong Kuei on the banner that couldn't be completely integrated with the Ingzhou genealogy, it would have been promoted to a stigmata relic. The projection of the ferocious ox head and the horse face appeared behind Taijima Dao, and Taijima Dao's body turned into a horrifying dark color. The third-order stigmata of the Ingzhou genealogy, 2FO. In front of him, the expression of the white paper man in his arms was stagnant, as if he was surprised. But it didn't seem like he was shocked by the enemy's power, but he was surprised that he didn't kill the enemy with one strike. "Very good, let's do it again." Huaishur grinned and stepped forward again, holding the blade in his hand high. Tang Zhu's power. At that moment, a loud thunder burst out again. Taijima Dao raised his hands without hesitation and blocked the 10 hands in front of his eyes again. But then his body involuntarily took a step back, and he was almost hit by the huge power of this blow. His arms were numb, and he didn't even have time to recover because Huaishur was in front of him again. The blade in his hand was raised high. Cut! The third strike. In the roar, Taijima Dao's arms cracked, and blood flowed out. He roared angrily and forcibly supported his defense. The Zhongkue horse eel in his other hand was raised high. The phantom of the god of ghouls opened his eyes and gave a blessing that was as hot as iron. But then, the shadow under Huaishur's feet shook, and the bone burial sanctuary opened a gap. From it, the dark substance flowed out, entangled Taijima's body, and spread inch by inch to the horse seal in his hand. Taijima felt as if he had been thrown into the ice sea and was swallowed by the cold. In that instant, he saw the phantom behind Huaishur. It was like a god patrolling the land of the dead had turned around and cast a disdainful glance at the mortal world. The slender eyes were burning with the brilliance of divinity. The Zhongkue army flag shook violently, and a crack appeared. Then, it was swallowed by the endless darkness in an instant and disappeared without a trace. Only the sound of chewing could be heard from the shadow, and the scarlet blade had already chopped down on his head. At the last moment, Taijima Dao's mind was blank. For some reason, he suddenly remembered the ferocious face of Yamamasa Mitsuaki and his words before he left. Was this the success of a general, the death of thousands? Darkness came and swallowed everything. Only the color of blood flowed freely in the air. A corpse had already fallen to the ground. Just behind Huaishur, the blood-soaked winnow rushed forward, picked up the head on the ground, and roared in all directions. Iron King faction's Taijima Dao has been taken. After losing the blessing of Zhongkue's horse seal, the following battle was simply a one-sided massacre. After dealing with the troublesome ascendants, Huaishur lowered his head and looked at the tip of his blade. A wisp of gray rose up and wrapped around his fingertip like dust. That was the death required for Great Si Ming's divinity transformation ritual. Just this? The corners of Huaishur's eyes twitched. She had killed so many people, but she couldn't even reach 1% of the goal. How long would she have to kill them all? However, if the quantity was insufficient, he could make up for it with quality. He turned his head and looked at Nagayakawa, who was fighting with Tenda Masashi. Nagayakawa seemed to have noticed something and suddenly looked back. Then, he saw that the distant figure had already become close to him. He even raised his head and gave him a simple and honest smile. Since you're already here. Chapter 766. It's the new year, and the child is still young. According to the process, the next sentence should be a death sentence. Huaishur stepped out and instantly entered the state of blood boiling. Under the state of blood boiling, you got a terrifying bonus, setting off a hurricane. Salted fish backstab. It was obviously a temporary idea, but it looked like it had been planned for a long time. It was so experienced that it made people angry. Seizing the moment when Tenda counterattacked, he attacked from the front and back. When Hasegawa looked back and saw the blade coming, his eyes almost popped out. Tenda had already blocked Hasegawa's blade, stepped forward, and swept across the waist. Waist cut. Hasegawa seemed to have eyes on the back of his head. At the critical moment, the key gun in his hand suddenly shrank. The cross-like key gun blocked Tenda's attack, and the sharp cone at the end of the long spear suddenly rose and pointed at Huaishur's throat. It was as if Huaishur deliberately pounced on him. With a slight stagnation, Huaishur's eyes blurred. He only saw a shadow suddenly emerge from behind Hasegawa, turning into a ferocious figure with an indigo face. His arms suddenly stretched out, his hands closed, and seized this opportunity to clamp Huaishur's blade. Under the sudden stab of the blade of resentment, a hole was cut in the palm of nothingness, and the source substance in it quickly flowed out and was swallowed by the crows. Facing Tenda, Hasegawa's face also turned indigo. It was completely different from the shadow that came out from behind him. It looked like a person with 2 heads and 4 arms. If it wasn't for the wrong place and different species, Huaishur almost thought that he was attacking a Neza, 3 jars of ocean god. But in the Dongxia pedigree, the 3-headed and 6-armed Neza was the manifestation of the Holy Spirit Zanjibala from India on the land of Dongxia. Between the three jars of heaven, earth, and water, the divine mark that could not be reproduced with the divine mark. So far, except for a few relics, it could not be reproduced at all. How could it be casually called a god by the people of Ingzhou? The opportunity was precious. Hasegawa pulled back and instantly withdrew dozens of meters. His face was pale. It was as if he had suffered a heavy blow for no reason. Double medicine fork stigmata. Amada was the first to see through the clues. He sneered. You new heavenly flow are really unpresentable. You have the inheritance of the secret ruins guardian deity, but now you've fallen to the extent of taking the unorthodox path. Hasegawa's expression was indifferent, and his eyes were scarlet. With his indigo face and the equally ferocious phantom behind him, he looked more and more inhuman. Huaishi's sword strike just now had indeed dealt a heavy blow to him. Or rather, it was because of the way he responded that his 5 years of hard work had gone to waste. The path of ascension passed down by the new heavenly flow was too harsh. The divinity related to the advancement of the medicine fork was firmly controlled by the big temples all over Ingzhou. Even their own people felt that it was not enough, so how could they give it to outsiders? Did he really think that Dami was easy to talk to? Since 12 years ago, Hasegawa had reached the third order, but after so many years, the medicine fork stigmata could not find the corresponding divinity and could not correspond to the fourth order. In desperation, he could only use the secret method of the new heavenly flow to implant the stigmata relic, Jundali Vajra scepter, into himself. Through the double existence of the medicine fork stigmata in the stigmata relic and the stigmata in his body, they intensified each other. Through the long-term communication and fusion of the source substance, he merged himself with the stigmata and the stigmata in it. With a double miracle, he crossed the edge of the fourth order and became the real secret ruins guardian deity. Once the combination was wrong, he would immediately lose his divinity, and only the path of the demon Suna would be left. Even the Jundali Vajra scepter, a treasure passed down by the new heavenly flow from generation to generation, would be scrapped. At that time, Hasegawa would be the shame of the new heavenly flow. He would not be able to pull off the pillar of shame in history. In the past 5 years, Hasegawa had relied on the 7 treasures of the Iron King faction to support him at all costs, and he had made rapid progress. Now that he had finally sprouted divinity and had just taken the right path, he was stabbed in the back by Huaishi. Die, you scoundrel! With a roar and a roar, the stigmata of the double medicine fork resonated and vibrated. The guardian medicine fork turned from illusory to solid. He reached out and pulled out a Vajra scepter covered with incantations and reliefs from Hasegawa's spine. The Vajra scepter, which was still stained with blood, shone brightly. He actually ignored Amada and rushed straight at Huaishi. Aren't you giving it to me for free? Huaishi smiled disdainfully and subconsciously touched his waist. Then he touched it again and realized that he was wearing a vest and did not bring Beelzebub. His face instantly turned green. He frantically retreated with used steps, and the hatred strike brushed past the tip of Huaishi's nose. The biting cold wind lifted Huaishi into the air. Immediately after, the spear of wondrous insight was like a snake drawing a strange arc in the air and appearing in the path that Huaishi had to take to dodge. Why are you throwing a tantrum with a young man? A mocking smile appeared on Amada Masato's face. The long sword in his hand was sheathed, and he assumed the posture of drawing his sword. The killing intent that had been nurtured by more than 10 years of sword meditation had already spilled out with the drawing of the sword in his mind. Air slash. The sharp sword marks crisscrossed in the air and shrouded Hasegawa's whole body, forcing him to stop. Just as he was about to attack again, he saw Huaishi suddenly take 3 steps back, and his body strangely fell down. Did he trip? Before Amada could react, Hasegawa was angry and did not care anymore. He swept his Vajra scepter and blocked most of the air slash, allowing the remaining sword marks to cut his body. Injury in exchange for death. He chanted the honorific name of Bodhisattva Kitachin Miaojian. and the spear technique that had been passed down from the godly skill bloomed with a blazing brilliance. He aimed at Huaishi's face and stabbed. The cold light that bloomed like the North Star illuminated the smile on Huaishi's face. The falling momentum suddenly stopped. Huaishi's hand, which was hidden behind her back, had already pulled out the katana that was stuck in the basket of the carriage. A painful black color appeared on the blade. In an instant, a mournful cry rose from the blade. Cord, the Xiang dragon roared. In the stagnant time, even Amada's mind was shocked by this moment. He widened his eyes in disbelief, but he could not see the movements of Huaishi's hands. He could only see the dark color and scarlet extending from Huaishi's hands and crisscrossing. The precious spear that was recast with dragonfly slash shook violently and broke at the waist. Then, blood burst out from Hasegawa's arms and even his chest. The sound of steel breaking sounded. It was the katana that Huaishi had thrown out, but it shattered in the air. At the same time, Huaishi had pulled out a dagger from his arms. Beheading. The dagger and the vajra collided, bursting out dazzling sparks. Before it could penetrate Hasegawa's throat, it disintegrated, and Hasegawa's scream of horror seemed to flow out from his throat in advance along with the blood. After a strange, ape-like scream, he frantically retreated, as if he saw a ghost. Frightened by the sword, he abandoned the remaining members of the Iron King faction and wanted to escape. But unfortunately, it was too late. When he turned his head, he saw Amada Masato behind him had bent down, his palm pressed on the hilt. Iato slash. The sword in the scabbard leaped out like a dragon and cut off his left leg. Then, the edge of the sword rose up and cut off his right arm. Just as Amada Masato was about to cut his heart, he heard Huaishi's hurried shout, "Tamada-senpai, have mercy!" Amada was stunned, and then immediately understood. That was close. He almost killed too much and forgot to leave one alive. Young people do things well. A guy like him who lives alone is getting old and can't keep up. Before he could finish sighing in his heart, he saw Huaishi rushing up with a rotten rope village full of cracks. With a jump, he chopped off Hasegawa's dog head. Blood splattered. Phew, that feels good. Huaishi let out a long breath, raised his hand, and wiped the sweat on his forehead, satisfied. Amada was stunned in place, dumbfounded. Unbelievable. Little brother, what's the matter with you? So you're trying to snatch the kill? You dog's hit? Didn't you tell me to have mercy? Amada's eyes widened. Huaishi's expression stiffened, and then he immediately squeezed out a flattering smile. I was afraid that you would be tired. As he said that, he bent down, picked up the vajra on the ground, wiped it, and then sneakily looked around and stuffed the vajra into Amada's sleeve. He didn't put it in properly once, and it fell to the ground. He picked it up again and stuffed it in again. Then he picked up the broken key gun, but this thing was too long, and it wasn't easy to put it in his sleeve, so he could only put it in his arms. Kindly accept it. Kindly accept it. Don't lower yourself to my level. Amada's expression twitched. As a lofty guardian in the Alliance, this was the first time in history that he was bribed. He should have angrily reprimanded Huaishi, but looking at that warm and considerate smile, his expression twitched, and the words that were about to come out of his mouth became much softer and filled with helplessness. Just this once, it couldn't be helped. It wasn't a bad thing for young people to have more thoughts about making a name for themselves. He didn't hold a position in the Alliance, so it was fine to let him give in. But before he left, he recalled that amazing sword strike just now, and turned around to ask, Haiki-kun, that move just now doesn't seem to be Tungo Mountain swordsmanship, right? Oh, yes, I figured it out myself. Huaishi grinned and smiled honestly. I'm learning sumo. Have you heard of the 4 styles? I'll show you, and I'll even give you a tattoo story. Like hell I'll believe you. Amada rolled his eyes and didn't want to talk to him anymore. 2 minutes later, the last person who was struggling in vain was pulled by the neck and thrown into the fire by Ueno, and the screams quickly disappeared. Just like that, the bonfire party came to an end in a joyous atmosphere. Unfortunately, the atmosphere wasn't right, and they couldn't drink beer, sing songs, and dance around the fire hand in hand. The Iron King Gang's assault team was completely wiped out. The price paid by the Huaishur group was only 16 people with minor injuries and 4 people with serious injuries. Most of them were affected by the battle between Amada and Hasegawa and were immediately sent to Kashihara Hospital. As for the rest, it was fine to just put on a Band-Aid. As the fire gradually extinguished, Huaishur looked down at his hand. Between his opened 5 fingers, a grayish-black color danced silently like thick ink. This was the death that appeared in the mandate of heaven. After offering the fallen medicine fork, Great Si Ming's divinity transformation took another step forward. But how many more deaths would it take to usher in a qualitative change? Chapter 767. For Otami Mitsuaki, this was yet another familiar night. At first, he was filled with anticipation. Then, he gradually felt awkward. In the end, it turned into hesitation and worry. Amidst his disappointment and sadness, he welcomed the morning sun for the second time. Damn it, you guys are also donkeys. In the empty garage, Otami Mitsuaki smoked alone. He raised his head and looked at the rising sun. He raised his arm and wiped the corner of his eyes. His eyes were almost wet. In the silence, the subordinate who had returned wanted to say something, but stopped. After hesitating for a long time, he walked up trembling. President, after a long time, Otami Mitsuaki turned around. Speak. The subordinate handed over his phone with trembling hands. The cable television channel on the phone was reporting the morning news. Last night, another traffic accident occurred in the suburbs. The Metropolitan Police Department reminded all citizens to pay attention to traffic safety and not to drive while drunk. A drop of alcohol from the driver, 2 streams of tears from the family. What do you mean by showing me this? Otami Mitsuaki asked faintly. I don't drink when I drive. Don't I have a driver? Being stared at by those eyes, the subordinate's small hands trembled again. Trembling, he picked up a box. This was just sent over by the Hybrid Alliance. Otami Mitsuaki waved his hand casually. Open it and see what's inside. A bomb? After opening the box, there was only a pile of fine powder inside. It was pale white, mixed with big and small particles, and there were also charred embers. It looked like the ashes left behind after something had been burned. They said that the item was returned to its original owner. Otami Mitsuaki did not fly into a rage as expected. He put out his cigarette and asked calmly, So they're all dead? Yes. The subordinate nodded. Then, he heard the roar of gunshots and fell into a pool of blood. Then why are trash like you still alive? Otami Mitsuaki lowered his head and stared at the lifeless eyes in the pool of blood. Did I keep you for so long just to let you show me the news? What the F***ck have you been doing? He raised his hand and pulled the trigger again and again. He turned around and shouted at the lifeless faces. Are you all mute? Trashed to such an extent, you are all dead and sent back by the heavens. You still F***king pretend that nothing happened. What had he been doing all this time? Were they trying to shift the blame to someone else? More than 140 people. Even if there were more than 100 pigs, Shang Tianmu wouldn't be able to kill them all in one night. The team members knelt on the ground and buried their heads deep into the cold ground, even if the blood that flowed over-soaked their foreheads. I finally figured it out. The real problem of the Iron King Party is not the Beastars, the Italians, and the Russian Federation, but right under my butt. De Jong roared angrily. Where's the person who promised me that he would be able to get the heaven-eyed dog's head this time? Taking the horse seal that I sold my old face to get from the higher-ups and giving it away for free. If this kind of trash didn't die, could it be that he was going to be left behind as a decoration? But what about you guys? Aren't you all the same as those pieces of trash who died? Someone even told me that the only way to take down Donbua Inner Circle in 2 days is to die so miserably that old bastard Shang Tianmu would laugh himself to death in the hospital. In the midst of the furious roar, a tinkling sound suddenly rang out. The phone rang. The passionate chorus of the female idol group echoed in the air, making the originally cold atmosphere become gentle. It was getting weirder and weirder. Whose phone is it? Get out here. De Zheng Guangshou roared, his eyes scarlet, unable to restrain his anger. But he immediately reacted, "Oh, it's mine. Then it's fine." He bent down and took out his phone from the pocket of his dead subordinate. He looked down at the caller ID and saw that it was an unknown number. He coldly picked it up. "Hello. Which one? If it's the guy who collects TV fees from Tokyo Electric Company, then be prepared to die." What answered him was a low voice with a strange accent. "It's me, good friend, Yevgeny." On the other end of the phone, the Russian Federation person seemed to take a deep breath. After a short silence, he let out a dazed and carefree moan. He let out a long breath. He said, "We have a business deal that we could talk about." De Zheng Guangshou's eyes turned, and his fierce expression gradually became meaningful. "The key is, how do you want to talk about it? Mr. Good Friend." "Someone will talk to you," the good friend said. "I'm just a middleman. You just need to receive them." After that, he hung up the phone. In the silence, he heard a voice behind him. "How pitiful. He's still not dead after 7 or 8 shots in a row." Full of pity, the man who suddenly appeared here looked down at the pair of eyes full of hope and desire. It was unknown whether it was pity or mockery, but unexpectedly, there was no sense of abruptness. It was as if he had always been here, but they didn't notice. Black hair, black eyes, white skin. He always had a distant and polite smile, like a Roman, but he spoke standard Ingzhou as if he grew up in Japan. He wore a traditional Ingzhou robe. After a burst of noise, he was instantly surrounded by layers of people. Behind the crowd, De Zheng Guangshou raised his pistol expressionlessly and asked coldly, "Who is it? Didn't I just say on the phone? The person who came to talk business with you is really rude. He doesn't know how to treat a guest at all." The visitor shook his head, seemingly helpless. He raised his hand slightly and said, "Please wait a moment. I really can't stand it anymore." He waved his hand casually, as if he was dismissing irrelevant people. The man lowered his head, slowly bent down, and stared at the twitching Kyoto in the pool of blood. "It's very painful, isn't it?" he asked softly. The dying man on the ground widened his eyes and stretched out his hand with all his strength. "Please save me. I will save you, don't worry." After saying those words, a brilliant smile appeared on the newcomer's face. He reached out and hugged the upper body in the pool of blood. Holding his neck, he softly whispered in his ear, "The so-called death is not something to be afraid of. It is the result of a long and peaceful sleep, the result of peace. Don't be afraid," he said. "It will be over soon." There was a cracking sound. With the gentle action, the pain was ended. The despair of the deceased disappeared and was replaced by a peaceful smile, as if he had walked into the land of dreams. Yamamasa Mitsuaki's expression twitched. In that moment of trance, he seemed to see something like a phantom rising from the pool of blood and floating into the sky, as if it had ascended to heaven. That person's neck had clearly been broken, but the corpse in the pool of blood on the ground was intact, and even the bullet hole had disappeared. In this sudden shock, the strange visitor had already stood up from the pool of blood and smiled brightly. "Okay, Mr. Yamamasa Mitsuaki, we can talk now." Dead silence. Obviously, under the protection of many subordinates, Yamamasa Mitsuaki suddenly felt a chill, as if he was alone. He should have immediately pulled the trigger and drawn a clear line with this kind of person who came from an unknown origin and spoke nonsense. But his movements paused for a moment. "I think, after playing the role of a comedian for so long, you must be tired, right?" He heard the words from the man. "Don't you want to get rid of the suppression of the looming hall and become the true underground king of Kyoto?" That pair of pitch-black eyes looked at him. With a smile that seemed to be eternal, he quietly admired. Inexplicably, he recalled the old priest in the church who advised him every time he gave alms when he was a child, "You can't talk to the devil." But now, when he finally understood this principle, he realized that it was already too late. He had already sunk deep into the mud. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the Huaiqi group drew a circle in the inner circle of Donbua. It was about 1/10 the size of the inner circle of Donbua. Including the territory of the Huaiqi group, there were a total of 7 blocks. With the help of the Jinchuan Society and other Green Sun factions, most of the manpower was borrowed and all the work was coordinated. Then, the order was re-established. In addition to setting aside an area to temporarily rent to those who had encountered disasters and were homeless, new rules were re-emphasized and all violent conflicts were put an end to. Ruata Mountain of the Huai-Chi group personally came forward and conveyed to the representatives of each block and the leaders of all walks of life that, including robbery and theft, all the chaotic acts that were born and nourished by the turmoil in the inner circle of Donbua were listed as prohibited matters. There were no complicated rules, but a simple sentence: let bygones be bygones. From today onwards, plunder once, break your hand, twice break your two hands, steal fingers, kill with your life. The loophole was not small. As long as they stole 11 times or snatched 3 times and killed 2 people, they would make a profit. They could not be punished at all. Such hypocrisy and pretentiousness was truly nauseating. Did they really think that the inner circle of Donbua was their own home? They could do whatever they wanted? Except for a few people who were really about to reach a dead and who had expectations. More people obeyed on the surface, but they were sneering in their hearts, guessing what medicine the Huai-Chi group was selling in their gourd. There were many people who expressed their dissatisfaction with this. Whether it was the loan shark company, the brothel keeper, the violent gang on the block, or the other gangs and societies that involved their own interests. For a time, there was an uproar, but their dissatisfaction was useless. The higher-ups of the alliance did not care at all. Even the Huangchuan family, who disliked the Huai-Chi group the most, remained silent. They were too lazy to care. They just watched them build a tall building and then waited for it to collapse. Sheng Tianmu, who had eaten 2 extra bowls of rice in the hospital, just wiped his mouth and said that it was a good thing that the young people wanted to make a difference. He could not dispel their enthusiasm. Moreover, the inner circle of Donbua should be controlled now. When the economy was affected by the turmoil and all the gray industries began to wither, the order that was barely maintained became riddled with holes. The trash waiting to take drugs and the local tyrants waiting to be drained began to take risks. In just 2 days, countless things had happened. Sheng Tianmu took this opportunity to be ruthless. He was even more ruthless than the Huai-Chi group. Before evening, the funeral parlors in the inner circle of Donbua had already started to line up for cremation. After a long 10 hours, the gradually worsening atmosphere in the circle finally stopped, but no one knew how long it would last. In the office, Huaisher picked up his teacup expressionlessly. After sending away another wave of annoying flies, he rubbed his swollen eyebrows. It felt like he was reaping what he sowed. The arrival of order did not restore the vitality of the block. It even caused a lot of people to leave and migrate. The chaos caused by this had not subsided until now. But to his surprise, he thought that young Master Ming's destiny would be affected after his extreme actions caused chaos in the circle. But to his surprise, it didn't affect her at all. Instead, Great Master Ming's conversion speed increased by a huge margin. Although it was better than nothing, it was still ridiculous. Can this count as a dead person's death? Huaisher felt a wave of unease wash over her. Could it be that the rules he set not only did not improve the atmosphere in the block, but also caused deaths and injuries? That cannot be right. Since this morning, only 6 people had died under the surveillance of the crows, and they were all people who took advantage of the chaos to commit arson. You've walked into the wrong area again, silly boy. As Huaisher's heart skipped a beat, a voice that often appeared at the same time as text messages rang in his ears. Tongi, he was stunned. Aya, what a surprise. I didn't expect you to improve so quickly after coming back from a trip. As the ink converged, the image of a cute crow appeared in front of him. She wiped the corners of her eyes with relief. You've grown up, Huaisher. Huaisher reacted and immediately rolled his eyes. He snorted in disdain. You still know how to come back? Look at what you're saying. I have my own business too. Tongi's tone became subtle, sounding weak and pitiful. I can't always be locked in the basement by you and do this and that, right? Who is doing what to whom? Can you please make it clearer? Huaisher glared at her, then stood up weakly. Forget it. Let's not talk about it. What's the wrong area you mentioned just now? I was just about to say it, but you interrupted me Tangi wanted to talk about something else, but Huaishir stared at her silently. She could not help but shrug helplessly, put on her small glasses, and then took out a small whiteboard and placed it on the table. The long-awaited lesson of Little Crow had begun. Chapter 768. Then, let us return to the essence of the path of heaven's inquisition. Tangi tapped on the whiteboard and wrote the word sharing on it with a quill-like object. From the beginning to the end, from level 1 to level 5, all stigmata cores are built around sharing. Its performance is to use its own power to gradually interfere with the outside world from the inside out. The quill pen then wrote on the whiteboard, "In souls, mountain ghosts, young arbiter of life." At the beginning, negative origin substances are used to establish the foundation, and then the mountain ghosts restore vitality. After forming an ecosystem, a large group is raised. Even if you take Xianjuan's branch path, it's still the same at this point. It's just that the type of the large group changes from the mountains to the sea. Tangi paused for a moment and asked, "You can understand now, right?" Huaishir nodded. Then, after the large group multiplies and spreads, it will bring about a new problem. Tangi said jokingly, "An overly strong ecosystem will have a strong impact on the outside world, just like how wild rabbits invaded Australia before they were bombed, and how dendrobium flourished in Indonesia. Overly violent interference will bring about unpredictable consequences. In other words, you will become an invasive species." Tangi told him, "The infernal realm is an infernal realm in the first place. If you don't do anything about it, it will definitely affect the balance of the realm due to the increase in distortion. Also, the decline after the peak is normal, and the large group itself can't continue for long." "What?" Huaishir was stunned. "I'm affecting the balance of the ecosystem? For example, it's just a possible consequence. But if you don't manage it and let it flow on its own, it will definitely reach this point in the end. The only difference is whether it's fast or slow." Seeing Huaishir's confused expression, Tangi thought for a moment and gave another example. "It's like you gathered a group of fans and formed an official Paradise Prince fan club group. Moreover, those passionate fans will spontaneously promote you, spreading like a virus, 1 spreading to 10, 10 spreading to 100. As a result, there are more and more people, and more. Unfortunately, the good times don't last." Tongji's smile became playful. "Unknowingly, you've realized that your fans are becoming more and more aggressive. Not only do they control and bully your fans on the internet, but they're also trolling people who don't like you or don't want to be your fans. They're attacking you, causing your reputation to get worse and worse. And this trend gradually spread to the real world. In the end, you realized that you had lost your friends, your job, and your social life. All you had left was your fans. Other than that, the entire world has become your enemy." Huaishir sucked in a breath of cold air, dumbfounded. It can't be right. Even he didn't dare to deny it completely. What's the difference between this and an illegal cult? He asked in shock. Tongji asked in confusion. Is the relationship between a fan and an idol fundamentally different from the relationship between a believer and a deity? The difference is nothing more than the names of the support funds and flowers. If you go out and take 7 steps in each direction in the Huaishir group and tell them that you're actually the reincarnation of the revered one, do you think Shangye will kneel on the ground and kowtow to you? Isn't this a little too exaggerated? Do you think that's the only problem? There's more, Huaishir. Without waiting for Huaishir to react, Tangi continued. There's something even more serious. Not only will they expand wildly, but they will also lose control internally. It's possible that in the beginning, a crow posted an edged picture in the Cage of Dreams, and you didn't notice. Then the second person followed suit, and the third person, and the fourth person. In the end, the crow will exchange all kinds of strange Ingzhou booklets and download links in the Cage of Dreams every day. Every day, their minds will be filled with pornography, and they will communicate with each other about their strange habits, becoming more and more perverted. At this point, Huaishir's face had already turned green. Tangi changed the topic or under the instigation of some people, everyone will start to be dissatisfied with everything that exists and attack the Astronomy Association strategy. The Directorate of Governance is bloated. The Continuation Institute is full of red deer. The archaeological team is full of bones in the tomb, and the technical department is full of trash. We should let our brother Huai Shi do something. All right, don't say any more. Huai Shi subconsciously pinched her beak and sucked in a dozen breaths of cold air, almost trembling in fear. He couldn't believe it. You're not going to court death like that, are you? What do you think? Tongi turned into smoke and crawled out from between her fingers. She reformed and combed her feathers. Guess how many young arbiters like you woke up and found that their flocks were gone? Huai Shi was speechless. So, at this time, we need a manager to stand up and be merciless. Tongi stood on Huai Shi's shoulder and whispered into his ear. She held up her little wings and made a throat-slitting gesture. No matter if it's the person who posted the pornographic pictures or the disharmonious elements that instigated the chaos, all of them must die. Now, do you understand what Great Arbiter of Fate is? Huai Shi heard his jaw drop to the ground. Indeed, Young Arbiter of Fate represents growth and life, while Great Arbiter of Fate represents decline and death. But in the path of Heaven's Inquisition, Great Arbiter of Fate's destiny is not simply to kill people, but to eliminate the calamities so that more people can live. Tongi told him, it has the ability to deter and attack the outside world, and at the same time, it also has the ability to rule and suppress the inside world. When there is an environmental threat in the outside world, it must stand up and eliminate the threat to prevent the calamity from descending. When there is a calamity in the inside world, it must be eliminated to prevent the inside world from going out of control. Maintaining the cycle of the inside and outside world, treating the race as a whole, and ensuring its safe and healthy growth. Now, do you know why Great Arbiter of Fate is said to be targeting his own people? Huai Shi's brain twitched. Instantly, countless vivid and lively images from movies appeared in his mind. The National Security Agency, Dragon Group, Kika, FBI, KGB, MI9, the Lubyanka Hotel provides food and accommodation? That's right. Tongi patted his shoulder in satisfaction. The development and protection of the children and the race from nothing, and even death and erasure when necessary. From this point of view, Young Arbiter of Fate and Great Arbiter of Fate's divinity are originally one. And because of this, there is a possibility of conversion before the fourth level. As long as what you do is consistent with this point, the conversion of Great Arbiter of Fate's divinity will become smoother and smoother. In silence, Huai Shi lowered his head and couldn't help but lift up the cage of dreams in front of him. Looking at the crows, looking at the small booklets, drawing cards, and doing pornography, his murderous intent rose. The birdcage is dirty again. Huai Shi was sharpening his knife to prepare for the first crow purge rectification campaign. After the lesson on Little Crow's knowledge ended, Tongi did not sneak a look at Huai Shi's account balance. Instead, she magically pulled out a thick stack of documents from the air and placed it on the table. Huai Shi picked it up curiously and looked at it carefully. He saw that the title was not in Chinese or Ingzhou, but in Latin. Beast Characteristics, Human Rights Protection Draft? He frowned and looked at the time under the cover. He found that it was actually more than a decade ago, and the logo on the document was actually from the American genealogy. What is this? As mentioned before, it's about the Feuerbach incident. I checked and found out. TSK. What a tragedy. Tongi sat on the Crimson God's wedge and sighed. Why are your friends so unlucky? I think there's something wrong with you. Bad luck attracts bad luck, you know? Huai Shi subconsciously stopped moving and looked serious. Cut the crap. Hurry up. When you're useful, you call me Sister Crow. When you're in a hurry, you don't even call me sister. Just like this, hurry up, Tongi shook her head and did not keep him in suspense. It started about 12 years ago. At that time, the American genealogy wanted to have an advantage in the development of the abyss. They vigorously absorbed border capital and had the intention of opening up the citizenship policy for hybrids. Under the relentless promotion of Yu Dongri in the Astronomy Society, the Foreign Affairs Director of the American Genealogy decided to have an official meeting with one of the leaders of the hybrids at the border. The location was Feuerbach at the border. In fact, before this, the two sides had contacted each other countless times in private. From probing to formal negotiations, even the draft had been revised. Under the situation where both sides had political and survival needs, although there were some bumps, they did not pose any obstacles. During this period, your friend, as the representative of the Astronomy Society, acted as the middleman. It can be said that he contributed a lot. But unfortunately, the problem arose in this meeting. Tanguy sighed with pity. The element of destruction came. Under the interference of the extremists, Feuerbach had long been infiltrated by the ranchers. When America opened the border and discovered the projection of paradise, it was already too late. Even the Bifrost could not stop the deepening of the depth. If the American genealogy did not react quickly and cut off the connection with Feuerbach, most of America might have been affected by the abyss tide. In the end, Feuerbach sank into hell. The American genealogy paid the price for their kindness and suffered heavy losses. No one mentioned the draft of human rights and the hybrid citizenship policy again. And because of their own abyss characteristics, the situation became more and more bleak. Yu Dongri's resonance physique was completely burned out in that incident, and he lost the qualification to be an apocalypse sentinel. In the end, he was cursed and was sent to the Dark Army. It was also from that time that he changed from Phoenix to Feuerbach's soul. It's as if a part of him had already died in Feuerbach. What's left is just an empty shell, a soul that's long dead. In Huaishi's silence, Tanguy sighed softly. Logically speaking, he should have completely lost the ability to jump through time, but he can use this power more frequently and crazily than before. It's really incredible. After all, it's a miracle that he can still move after falling to this extent. It's not surprising when he completely collapses. The rancher's curse? Huaishi recalled the dirty black blood in Reynolds' body, which was like the precipitation of all the malice in the world, the palpitating, corrosive, and destructive power. Rather than calling it a curse, isn't it more appropriate to call it saliva? The remaining traces after escaping from the mouth of the gods. Tanguy sneered. In comparison, the curse problem and his own problem, I really don't know which is more serious. He hates himself too much, and he can't bear the guilt. He's living like a walking corpse, and there's not a day that he doesn't repent. Why sure, he's living in the hell he created, and there's no cure for him. The more glorious the star, the bigger the black hole formed once it dies. The guys in hell love this kind of soul the most. Once it solidifies, it's definitely a rare fallen star in history. The question is, how long can he last? How long can you last, Yu Dongri? In his drowsy sleep, Yu Dongri heard a mocking voice. He subconsciously raised his gun and saw a familiar figure. Under the gorgeous oil paper umbrella, the complicated 12 lines of Ingzhou set off the Roman-style face, which was as beautiful as a peach and plum, like a legendary courtesan. Black eyes and long black hair. His smile was so gentle, but it also made people feel that he was very far away. Yu Dongri didn't answer. In the silence, the sound of a mobile phone vibrating came from the narrow, safe room. The screen of the mobile phone on the table lit up, and Huaishi's name appeared. "Aren't you going to answer the phone?" The caller asked. "Your friend is very concerned about you." Yu Dongri raised his gun indifferently, aimed at her face, and said word by word, "This has nothing to do with you." "How many times has it been?" The caller looked down at him with pity. "You won't win this time, Yu Dongri. You should learn to give up. Perseverance won't only bring you victory, but it will also bring you deeper into hell." Bang! A gunshot sounded. It pierced through that pretty face, causing it to burst apart like a bubble. "I haven't lost yet." Yu Dongri said goodbye coldly. "It's okay." Before the bubble dissipated, she or he said goodbye gently. "I'll wait forever." Chapter 769. Yu Dongri had disappeared again. After a day of phone calls, Huaisha finally confirmed this point at 9 o'clock in the evening. To be exact, he learned from Sheng Tianmu's family that Miss Li Hua had gone out yesterday and hadn't returned yet. He didn't pick up his calls, didn't reply to his WeChat messages, and couldn't find her anywhere. It was like a man who suddenly said that he had to go on a business trip with a beautiful female boss, but due to limited budget, he only booked one room. What the hell is this bastard doing? Huaisha held his phone and was angry. Oh, what the hell does the time jumper want to do? This is one of the top 10 difficult questions in the world. The difficulty is probably second only to what is your girlfriend thinking? Tongi sighed. He's probably hiding from you. After all, he's a time jumper. If he wants to find someone, he always has a way. In other words, if he doesn't want to be found, I'm afraid that no matter how much time you spend, it will be a waste of effort. Once you enter that state for a long time, your thinking will gradually become different from ordinary people. You'd better not take it for granted. It was like the world in the eyes of a painter was different from ordinary people, and musicians were more sensitive to sound. This was the difference brought about by a long time of immersion. Ordinary people's thinking relied on their senses, and their senses were limited by their own body structure and cognition. They couldn't break through the ordinary framework to think about the world in the eyes of a time jumper. They couldn't get close to their thinking. When the continuity of time was interrupted, the cause and effect that ordinary people relied on would be clear at a glance. In the countless intricate changes, no one knew where the node Yu Dongri was focusing on was, and no one knew what kind of result he was looking for. Perhaps he had long since lost himself in this endless cycle. Time jumping and changing the future had always been two different things. All along, the time jumpers of Bifrost had been facing a paradox full of ridicule. The more they wanted to change, the more they would consume. If a matter wasn't serious enough to require a time jump, then there was no need to make a time jump and pay a higher price. However, if a matter had already reached a point where it could no longer be salvaged, it would most likely be useless even if one were to use another time jump. Rome wasn't built in a day. Even if they basked in the sun for one more day, the avalanche was still unavoidable. With Yu Dongri's efforts alone, no matter how many times he went back, he would not be able to change the tide. Reality isn't a game. Why sure? Even if cheating can solve the problem, I've never heard of a happy ending by cheating. Tongi said with pity, even if it's a miracle, there are things that can't be changed. In the end, he suddenly threw the matter of the alliance to me like it was a mess, and then he patted his butt and left. Huaisha slammed the table, unable to restrain his anger. What kind of F***ing logic is this? Do I have to work hard to gather everyone to pray for him and hope that he'll be fine? Tongi did not say anything. He just looked at him sympathetically, until he fell silent again. In fact, if Yu Dongri could just leave and obediently receive treatment, Huaisha would feel more at ease. But would he really escape? In other words, would that guy turn back from the path of death? It was said that birds of a feather flocked together. How could Huaisha not know what the bald man was thinking in his head? He would definitely pretend to be cool, even when he was about to die. Come on, brother. I'll do what I have to do. I'll leave the rest to you. In the silence, Huaisha suddenly felt a burst of loneliness and uneasiness. When Yu Dongri entrusted him with great trust, Huaisha finally felt the fear and confusion he had experienced before. Tongi. Huaisha leaned on the chair tiredly and suddenly whispered, if I finally fail completely here and lose everything, will you be disappointed in me? Maybe. I don't like people who overestimate themselves. Tongi looked at his eyes and asked curiously, but why sure, even if you fail in the end, will you regret everything you've done now? Huaisha did not answer. So, Tongi chuckled softly, so happy. Very good. Huaisha, you really are the best contractor in the world. With the disappearance of the flying bird, a pair of gentle hands stroked his cheeks, hugged him from behind, and softly declared, just do it, Huaisha. She said, no matter what the result is, I will bear witness to you, just like you bear witness to me. That was the initial agreement between them. The road sign was activated again. 31. In the morning, he had to clean up the living room before opening the door. At noon, he was responsible for delivering food. After Ms. Tomoko stayed behind to help, his task became delivering takeout. He had to deliver lunch to the Yakuza uncles who looked very fierce. In the afternoon, the lady boss would teach him knife skills and cooking skills, so he had to study hard. When it was almost nighttime, he found that the roof began to leak again, so he volunteered to carry wooden planks and tools and climb up to the roof. After quickly replacing the wooden planks and mending the bottom, Makoto put down the hammer in satisfaction and wiped the sweat off her forehead. She proudly put her hands on her hips. On the roof of the izakaya's third floor, as the sun gradually set in the distance, the entire city seemed to be covered in a layer of dim glory. The sound of children crying could be heard in the distance, and scattered lights in the shabby apartment building lit up. It looks a bit lonely. She sighed softly. Hey, Maki, come down, don't be in a daze. Behind the house, Tomoko looked up at the girl who was about the same age as her and shouted, It's dangerous. Come down first. Don't worry. It's nothing. Tomoko, be careful. Maki waved her hand indifferently, picked up the toolbox, and walked towards the ladder with the planks. Then she slipped. Why is there a pair of pliers here? All right, I think I dropped it. The world was spinning, and before Shin could react, she had already fallen into the ground in the backyard. It was a loud bang. Satoko was stunned. Subconsciously, she rushed up to take a look. However, as soon as she took a step forward, she saw the toolbox on the roof fall down and hit Makoto's head. Makoto, who had just gotten up, fell down again. And then there were the planks piled up on the edge of the roof and the ladder. It was like a scene from a cartoon. The chain reaction continued, and the backyard was instantly in a mess. Ah, so this is where today's bad luck comes from. In the dust, Maki opened her eyes, coughed, and got up. Next to him, Tomoko was already stunned. Although she already knew that Maki's bad luck would often be off the charts in the past few days, but for it to be this ridiculous, it could only be compared to a few days ago when a gas pipe exploded while walking on the street. Maki, are you all right? Ahem, I'm fine, don't worry, I'll clean this place up. Let's talk about that later. Isn't it more important to check if there are any wounds first? Tomoko moved the ladder and planks away and found that although she looked terrible, she only twisted her ankle a little, and there wasn't even a single wound on her body. She had copper skin and iron bones. That's ridiculous. Tomoko was stunned. I always feel like you're the kind of person who can swim back to shore by yourself after being thrown into the Pacific Ocean. That's too ridiculous. It's impossible. Maki waved her hand awkwardly. When the ship crashed last time, I almost couldn't swim back to Kyushu from the 5 islands. Oh, fortunately, I met Uncle Takahashi at the port. Otherwise, I don't know what to do. Tomoko was stunned, and she felt that it was ridiculous from the bottom of her heart. They were both mixed race, but the gap between them was so huge. Seeing that Maki had begun to clean up the things on the ground, she shook her head hard and pulled her up. Anyway, go take a shower first. We'll talk about the things in the yard tomorrow. Half an hour later, Maki, who had finally finished cleaning up, changed into Tomoko's clothes and dried her hair. She was full of vitality again. I really envy you. It seems like you'll never run out of strength. Tomoko pinched the corners of her muscles on her arms and her firm and flat belly and looked helpless. I can't even run a few steps now, and I have to pant when going upstairs. Do you think I used to be in the track and field club? Tomoko, you're a literary girl. Don't worry about it. Maki grinned and went to the kitchen to prepare for work. But when she passed by the front desk, her eyes were attracted by the person in front of the door. An old woman came to visit with a smile on her face, holding the hand of the proprietress and saying something enthusiastically. The proprietress responded helplessly, but she didn't listen to her no matter what. What does that person do? Maki whispered. The granny in the fruit shop across the street seems to have joined a nearby fraternity recently, and she became like a salesperson. In the past few days, she came every day to waste people's time, and she didn't listen to me no matter what. Tomoko shrugged helplessly. But when the old woman saw Tomoko come down, her smile became more enthusiastic, and she wanted to go around the proprietress. until the proprietress stopped her and said a few words with a serious expression. She was stunned for a moment and left embarrassedly. Before she left, she put a bottle of medicine on the counter and encouraged Tomoko to study hard from afar before she turned around and left. After watching her leave, the proprietress sighed helplessly, picked up the medicine bottle from the table, and shook it. There were a few pills in the bottle, but there was no label or ingredient on the outside. It looked strange. "What is this?" Maki curiously went up to the bottle. "It says it's a painkiller, and it can alleviate the complications of animal characteristics, but there isn't even a label or an instruction manual." The proprietress shook her head and sighed, and then she came to a realization. She turned around and said to Maki seriously, "Maki, you have to be careful. If you feel uncomfortable, remember to tell me. Don't take medicine of unknown origin. This kind of medicine can only be used according to the doctor's instructions after the doctor has opened the kitchen." "Ah, Annie Jean Jiang, don't worry, I've always been in good health." Makai laughed and struck a pose of strength. Jean Jiang looked at her suspiciously and reminded her again and again. After making sure that she wouldn't be stupid enough to take medicine of unknown origin, she was relieved. After that, she wiped the table, cleaned the counter, and so on. There was still a lot of work waiting for Maki. Recently, all the helpers and apprentices in the shop seemed to have resigned, and a lot of work fell on her. However, those who responded to her request had their salaries increased by a lot. In between work, Maki turned around and looked at the medicine bottle that the proprietress had thrown into the trash can. She couldn't help but sneeze. What a strange smell. It was like a stew that had been left out for a long time. Even if it could fill her stomach, wouldn't it give her a stomachache? "Maki, come and cut the vegetables." A voice called out from the kitchen. Okay. Maki turned around and ran to the kitchen. She didn't notice the strange atmosphere on the street at all. For Maki, it was still a busy day with plenty to eat. As the twilight gradually faded, dark clouds gradually appeared in the sky, and faint thunder could be heard in the distance. Not long after, a heavy rain poured down. The heavy curtain of rain and the loud noise covered the rising flames in the distance. Chapter 770. It's going to rain. Take care, everyone. In front of the fraternity's dilapidated entrance, a middle-aged man patiently handed out umbrellas and reminded the participants, "It's been a bit chaotic outside recently. If you're not free, don't come. If you need, you can stay here for the time being. There are still many beds." No. Doctor, it's already hard for you to take care of so many patients." The participants all waved their hands. "Let's not trouble you. It's fine. It's just one more bed." Dr. Shun Chung smiled warmly. He stood in the rain, watching the old man and children leave. After a long time, just as he was about to turn back, he heard hurried footsteps in the distance. They were stumbling through the mud. The middle-aged woman cried hoarsely. Her disheveled hair was stuck to her face, and her prematurely aged face was filled with fear. "Dr. Godlike, is Dr. Godlike here? I beg you, save him, save my child." She lifted the raincoat made of plastic bags and carefully picked up the child in her arms. In the woman's arms, the child, who was about 12 years old, had already lost consciousness from the fever. His red face was twisted and stiff and covered in herpes. His skinny limbs were already deformed. Large patches of skin had fallen off, and blood kept seeping out. Some parts had been torn apart from the friction, and mucus was seeping out. Progressive myositis ossificans. The doctor frowned. "You should go to the hospital if you have symptoms of a fever. Why did you come so late?" I don't have a job. It wasn't easy for me to find a job in the Fujin district. I just went out for a while. The wretched woman tried to explain herself incoherently as the doctor pulled her up from the ground. "Stop talking. Prepare for the operation first. Time is of the essence. Nurse, is the nurse here?" Very quickly, the nurse and assistant rushed out from behind the door and picked up the child. They hurriedly prepared for the operation. The doctor paused for a moment. He turned around and said softly to the dazed woman, "There's not much hope. I hope you're ready." The woman was stunned. In the rain, The surprise on her face was gradually washed away like sand. It was impossible to tell what kind of expression she had left behind. After a long time, she squatted weakly on the ground and let out a sharp cry. "Don't be afraid. Everyone will be saved soon." Shin Chung turned his back to her and said softly, "Soon, everyone will stop suffering." Only the woman's hoarse cries could be heard in the silence. In the distance, on the rooftop, the torrential rain washed the black raincoat. Yu Dongri ate the rations in silence. One mouthful after another, he calmly swallowed the last grain. He looked down silently. He did not say a word. "Is it raining?" In the ward, Sheng Tianmu leaned lazily on the bed. He raised his eyes and looked out of the window. The plum rain season has arrived. Every year at this time, I feel sticky and uncomfortable. My arms and legs hurt so much. Looks like I'm really getting old. Originally, Huaishir should have said something like the president was still in his prime, but he couldn't help but nod his head in agreement as he looked at the wrinkles on his face. Yes, when one is old, one should quickly retire and give up one's position. You're lying in the hospital. Why don't you give me the position of the president of the alliance? Let me experience the pleasure of taking turns to be the president of the alliance. After waiting for a long time, he found that Huaishir only squeezed out a yes and looked straight at him, full of expectation. Sheng Tianmu wanted to roll his eyes. "I've waited my whole life to be the president of the alliance. I plan to be the president until I die. Huaishir, can you stop dreaming?" It's hard to say. There are always accidents. Huaishir thought for a moment before advising, "President, you're getting on in years. You should make arrangements for your funeral as soon as possible. Leave the burden of the alliance to a young and promising person like me. Young people should work more and dream less." Sheng Tianmu was too lazy to pay attention to him. He touched his pocket and found that he was wearing a hospital gown. He pointed to the bedside table and motioned Huaishir to open it. After opening it, he found a heavy pistol inside. Huaishir was stunned. He looked at the pistol and then at Sheng Tianmu. What was the meaning of this? Did the old man want him to help him end his life? His hair stood on end when he was stared at by that strange gaze. Sheng Tian was furious. Why did this bastard dream of getting rid of the big boss every day and taking over his position? If you continue to be like this, I'll have to ask Tian Tian to come in and kill you. Being stroked again and again, Sheng Tianmu became angry. "Help me take out the thing next to the pistol." It was a key with a house number written on it. Sheng Tianmu held it in his hand and thought for a long time. After a long time, he shook his head and sighed. He threw it to Huaishir. "What's this?" "It's something prepared in the early years. As a result, the older I get, the more timid I become. It's not useful at all." Sheng Tianmu shook his head and sighed. "Since we're talking about the funeral arrangements, to be on the safe side, I'll give you this thing, just in case." Originally, Huaishir had a lot of teasing, but Sheng Tianmu's behavior made him a little surprised. The situation is already so serious? You've been busy with your Huaiji group's territory these 2 days. You didn't pay attention to anything else at all, right? Sheng Tianmu thought for a moment and suddenly said, "The Yamada Gumi was completely wiped out in the morning." Huaishir frowned. He recalled the old man he had dealt with before. He was smart, capable, and cautious. He was also one of the most cunning people in the alliance. When he was dealing with the Tiger King group's inheritance, he severely cheated him. Now, the whole group was wiped out. They died just like that. In the 2 days when Huaishir was tidying up his territory, the war between the alliance and other gangs had already begun in full swing. Although a full-scale war didn't break out, local conflicts continued. Vendettas, assassinations, attacks, and revenge were common. Now, there were very few people strolling on the streets. They were all afraid of being involved in the revenge of the Iron King group. "What about the aftermath?" Huaishir asked. "Akaki has already done it. Don't worry." Sheng Tianmu said, "Since you have the intention to set up a shelter in the inner circle of Donbua, then do it well. If there are victims, I will also ask him to send them over. The turmoil this time might be your opportunity." It was precisely under the high pressure of the president that Huaishir was able to soar like a rocket. However, his foundation was still unstable. If Huaishir could really take advantage of this opportunity to complete the gathering of people's hearts, it might not be an empty promise that he would be the next president in the future. Huaishir looked down at the key in his hand. After listening to Sheng Tianmu's arrangement, he realized that this old man was really grooming him as his successor. He couldn't help but feel a little touched. He said, "I won't stay for long. When this matter is over, I might not stay for long. It's always a way out, isn't it?" Sheng Tianmu couldn't be bothered with the things that Huaishir was hiding. He waved his hand and said, "Do your work well first. Don't think too much. If you mess it up, this old man might be the first to give the order to kill you." Huaishir said goodbye and got up. Just as he was about to leave, he couldn't help but turn back and ask, Cough, cough. Did Li Hua say anything before she left? For example, what she left for me? How would I know? Sheng Tianmu glanced at him with a strange expression. "Although I've never cared about the affairs of young people, you'd better not be too presumptuous." The real Li Hua was still at the border. "All of you, stop harming the reputation of his obedient daughter. Otherwise, how could she get married in the future?" Other things aside, that feeling of disdain was completely conveyed through his eyes. Huaishir chuckled, bid farewell, and left. In the ward that had returned to silence, Sheng Tianmu sighed. After thinking for a moment, the old man suddenly looked up. "Tamadis-san, help me get the phone." After leaving Kashihara Hospital, Winnow drove slowly in the heavy rain. Even with the windshield wipers turned on, it was still difficult to see clearly under the washing of the rain. After deliberately choosing a remote road, there were not many cars on the empty street. It was so quiet that it was like passing through a flooded world. But during this short break, Huaishir suddenly looked up. In the storm outside, the steel crow circling in the sky caught a glimpse of a strange figure that flew through the air like a ghost. The moment it caught a glimpse, it saw a strand of something that looked like a woman's hair suddenly fly out of the shadow and pierce through the crow's eyes from hundreds of meters away, tearing it apart. An instant later, the crow was reborn in the cage of dreams through the return of origin substance. It cawed angrily, unable to fly into a rage. Winnow break. Just as he was speaking, Huaishir saw the strange shadow descend from the sky. Under the flickering street lights in the storm, it suddenly landed on the road. Countless hair-like strands of twisted hair extended from its body, wriggling wildly. Immediately afterwards, under the wriggling hair, thousands of pairs of eyes suddenly opened, staring straight at Huaishir, who was speeding over a kilometer away. An evil light burst forth. Ambush! Stimulated by the premonition of death, Huaishir reached out and suddenly turned the steering wheel. The heavy car skidded in the rain and swerved randomly. It wobbled and slammed into a wall. Half of the car broke through the gate and rushed into a shop that had long since closed down. The sound of the car collapsing could be heard. It was as if thousands of sharp blades had slashed at it. The back half of the car that had been grazed by the evil light instantly fell apart. Huaishir kicked Winnow out of the car that was about to explode. He opened the door and stepped on the burning gasoline on the ground as he walked towards the figure that was getting closer and closer after the storm. Under the protection of the countless hair-like tentacles, the constantly opening and closing vicious eyes stared fixedly at Huaishir. A hoarse voice seemed to come from the tremors of the rain. "Paper doll." Huaishir had just nodded and didn't even have time to reply when he felt the premonition of death suddenly burst forth. After the ground beneath his feet trembled, a sharp, pitch-black hair suddenly broke through the restraints of the ground and tangled around him. When he dodged to the side, he saw the wriggling hair suddenly contract. Between the hair, an ice-cold eye slowly opened, and a gaze filled with malice shone on his face. Ingzhou lineage, level 4, 100-eyed ghost. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.